On the morning of April 11th, 1919, an elderly woman in black stood on the quayside at Yalta Harbor, watching British sailors load her trunks onto a warship. She was 71 years old. Her eldest son had been murdered 9 months earlier in a basement in Ekaterinburg, along with his wife and all 5 of their children. Her jewelry was packed in cases beside her. Her servants stood in line behind her, holding papers they had never needed before, certificates issued by a foreign navy attesting that they were permitted to leave their own country. HMS Marlborough sat in the harbor. 14,000 tons of gray steel, its gun turrets angled toward a coastline that was no longer safe. The Black Sea was flat and colorless. The Dowager Empress did not weep. She boarded the ship with the posture of a woman attending a court reception, and she did not look back at the coast of Crimea as it disappeared into the mist. The people around her, her daughters, her grandchildren, her retainers, carried between them the remnants of a dynasty that had ruled Russia for 304 years. They carried titles, habits, grief, and a handful of diamonds. They did not carry a future. The Romanovs were the largest, richest, and most powerful royal family in Europe. The world remembers the ones who died, the Tsar, the Tsarina, the children in the cellar. It has largely forgotten the ones who lived. This is the story of the Romanovs who survived, and of the decades that proved survival was not the same as rescue. From London grace-and-favour houses to Parisian taxicabs, from embroidery workshops supplying Chanel to a Canadian farm, where the Tsar's youngest sister painted flowers to pay the bills. This is what happened to a dynasty after the dynasty ended. To understand how the survivors of the Romanov dynasty came to be standing on a British warship in the Black Sea, watching the Crimean coast disappear behind them, you have to go back much further than 1917. You have to go back 3 centuries to 1613, when a 16-year-old boy named Michael Romanov was chosen by a council of Russian nobles to become Tsar, founding a dynasty that would rule the largest country on earth for the next 304 years. That is not a decorative piece of context. It is the foundation of everything that followed. The wealth, the palaces, the marriages, the jewels, the court rituals, the assumptions of permanence, and ultimately the catastrophic inability of an entire family to imagine that any of it could end. The Romanovs were not merely rich, they were the state. Their power did not rest on a private fortune managed through banks and solicitors in the manner a British viewer might recognize from the English country house tradition. It rested on imperial appanages, crown properties, court rank, military commissions, state stipends, and a social architecture in which proximity to the throne determined everything. Where you lived, whom you married, what regiment you commanded, how many servants answered your bell. The palaces in St. Petersburg alone could fill a guidebook. The Winter Palace, the Vladimir Palace, the Marble Palace, the Anichkov Palace, each one home to a different branch, each one staffed, furnished, and maintained according to the occupant's position in the dynasty's internal hierarchy. Beyond the capital, there were the imperial residences at Tsarskoye Selo and Gatchina, the summer retreats in Crimea, Aitodor, Dolber, Korais, the Danish refuge at Vidura, the hunting lodges, the country estates. The geography of Romanov life before 1917 was a geography of certainty. Every address confirmed a rank. Every room reflected a status that had been inherited, negotiated, or bestowed by the sovereign himself. What that system did not produce in most cases was practical independence. The men were trained for military command and court ceremony. The women were trained for dynastic marriage, social performance, and the management of enormous households staffed by people who did the actual work of daily life. Many of the Romanovs, who would later find themselves in exile, had never purchased their own food, never negotiated a lease, never balanced a household account against earned income. That was not laziness. It was the logic of a system that assumed the system would always exist. When it stopped existing, the people it had formed were not merely impoverished. They were untrained for the world that impoverishment required them to inhabit. By the early 20th century, the dynasty had grown into something closer to a small nation than a single family. There were Grand Dukes and Grand Duchesses, princes and princesses of the blood, morganatic wives whose status was perpetually contested, and a web of marriages linking the Romanovs to virtually every other European royal house. The British connection ran deepest. Tsar Alexander III had married Princess Dagmar of Denmark, whose sister Alexandra married the future King Edward VII of Britain. That meant their children were first cousins. When Nicholas II succeeded his father in 1894 and married Princess Alix of Hesse, herself a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, the entanglement doubled. King George V and Tsar Nicholas II looked so alike that photographs of the two men standing side by side are still used to illustrate the genetic closeness of European royalty in the early 20th century. That resemblance would later carry a terrible irony. When the revolution came, the cousin who looked like the Tsar would prove unable, or unwilling to save him. But all of that was still in the future. In the years before the First World War, the Romanov world presented itself as ancient, magnificent, and permanent. The family staged its own continuity with theatrical conviction. In February 1913, the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty was celebrated across Russia with processions, Te Deums, gala performances, and a carefully orchestrated tour of historical sites associated with the founding of the house. Photographs from the tercentenary show the imperial family in full regalia, diamonds, sashes, uniforms, tiaras, surrounded by officials, clergy, and crowds. The message was unmistakable. 3 centuries of divine mandate, unbroken and unbreakable. That celebration took place 4 years before the abdication. The family that performed permanence in 1913 would be scattered across Europe by 1920, many of its members murdered, the rest selling jewelry and renting rooms in cities where their titles meant nothing and their skills meant less. There is something about that 4-year gap that is worth sitting with for a moment. It was not simply that the Romanovs lost power. It was the speed at which a 300-year edifice became irrelevant. The people who survived that collapse carried its aftershock for the rest of their lives. To tell the story of what happened to those survivors, you need to know who they were. Not as names on a family tree, but as individuals with temperaments, ambitions, marriages that worked or did not, and private vulnerabilities that the imperial system had both created and concealed. The center of the surviving family was the Dowager Empress Maria Feodorovna, born Princess Dagmar of Denmark in 1847. She had married the future Alexander III in 1866 and become Empress Consort of Russia, a position she inhabited with formidable social command for more than a decade before her husband's death in 1884. By the time of the revolution, she was nearly 70 years old, widowed, and watching her eldest son's reign collapse under the weight of war, scandal, and political miscalculation she had long feared. She was the emotional matriarch of the exile story, still queenly, still obeyed within the family, still addressed with deference that had survived the disappearance of the state that once enforced it. In the years that followed, she would refuse fully to accept that her son and his children had been murdered. Whether that refusal was genuine disbelief or a psychological defense against unbearable knowledge is something the historical record does not settle. What is not in dispute is that she remained. Until her death at Videra in Denmark on October 13, 1928, the figure around whom the surviving Romanovs still oriented themselves, even as the orbit grew wider and the center held less and less. Her daughter, Grand Duchess Zenia Alexandrovna, born in 1875, would become the anchor of the London story. Before the revolution, Zenia had been beautiful, socially assured, and married to Grand Duke Alexander Mikhailovich, known within the family as Sandro, a naval officer, political commentator, and man whose intelligence about the empire's weaknesses had not been matched by any power to address them. Their marriage had produced 7 children. It had also cooled, long before exile made everything harder, into something more like cohabitation than partnership. Sandra was worldly, opinionated, and emotionally distant. Zenia was devout, resilient, and recognizably imperial in bearing even when imperial finances had ceased to exist. In exile, she would become the Romanov most visibly folded into British royal life. Housed first at Frogmore Cottage, later at Wilderness House, in the grounds of Hampton Court Palace, and the family member whose trajectory most clearly illustrated what it meant to survive with dignity intact and independence gone. She was dependent, she was proud, she was the sister of the last Tsar living in grace-and-favour accommodation provided by his cousin's family. That combination of status and subjection defined her for 40 years. On the other side of the family tree sat Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, born in 1891, a grandson of Alexander II, whose life had already been shaped by proximity to catastrophe before the revolution arrived. Dmitry's mother had died in childbirth. His father, Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich, had remarried morganatically, a union that scandalized the court and led to Paul's temporary exile. Dmitry and his sister Maria Pavlovna were raised largely by their uncle, Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, whose assassination in 1905 added another layer of violence to childhoods already marked by loss. Dmitri grew into a handsome, charming, emotionally unmoored young man whose most consequential pre-revolutionary act was his involvement in the murder of Grigory Rasputin in December 1916. That involvement led to his banishment from the capital, a punishment that, by the bitter arithmetic of revolution, almost certainly saved his life. He was already away from St. Petersburg when the monarchy fell. In exile, he would drift through London and Paris, live in hotel rooms and modest flats, work in connection with a champagne firm, conduct a much-discussed liaison with Coco Chanel, marry American heiress Audrey Emery in 1926, and die of tuberculosis in a sanatorium in Davos in 1942. He was 50 years old. He had spent half his life as a Grand Duke and half as a man for whom that title had become a social curiosity rather than a source of power. Dmitri's sister, Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna, known as Marisha, may be the single most instructive figure in the entire exile story. Born in 1890, she shared Dmitri's orphan, displaced childhood, but responded to exile with a practicality and candor that he never managed. After escaping through Ukraine and Romania, she found herself in London and then Paris, with no income, no profession, and no experience of earning money. She began by knitting garments for sale. She progressed to founding Kitmir, an embroidery workshop employing fellow Russian refugees, which became successful enough to supply the House of Chanel. When fashion embroidery waned, she attempted to launch a perfume called Prince Igor. She married twice, lost a young son, sold what she had built, moved on, and wrote about all of it with a directness that strips the exile experience of any residual glamour. Her admission that she had known the price of jewels and dresses her entire life, but had never known the price of bread and milk is not a charming anecdote. It is the thesis of this story expressed in one sentence. She was a woman of taste, intelligence, and considerable talent, who had been raised inside a system that equipped her for everything except the life she actually had to live. Grand Duke Kirill Vladimirovich, born in 1876, carried a different thread entirely. A first cousin of Nicholas II, through the Vladimir branch of the family, Kirill had survived the sinking of the battleship Petropavlovsk during the Russo-Japanese War and had stirred controversy by marrying his first cousin, Princess Victoria Melita of Saxe-Coburg, without imperial permission. In exile, he became the dynasty's self-appointed political heir, eventually proclaiming himself head of the imperial house and, in 1924, emperor and autocrat of all the Russias, a claim that divided the family and survives today through his granddaughter Maria Vladimirovna, whose official house website remains active. Kirill was not the emotional heart of the exile story. He was its political complication, the branch that refused to treat exile as merely a personal misfortune and insisted on turning it into a continuing constitutional argument. Whether that insistence was admirable or delusional depended on which Romanov you asked. It still does. His brother, Grand Duke Andrei Vladimirovich, born in 1879, brought the story a different texture altogether. Andrei had been attached for years to Matilda Kshesinska, the legendary ballerina who had been intimate with Nicholas II before his marriage and had subsequently become Andrei's companion and eventually his wife. Kshesinska was not born Romanov, but she earned her place in this story through force of personality, professional brilliance, and sheer survival instinct. And in exile, after gambling losses and the financial crash of 1929 had destroyed much of what the couple retained, it was Kshesinska's Paris ballet school that kept the household afloat. She taught until she was well into her 80s. She died in 1971 at the age of 99. If Zinnia represented diminished dignity, Andrei and Kshesinska represented compromised survival through talent, fame, and the willingness to turn imperial glamour into a marketable skill. Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, born in 1882, was Nicholas II's youngest sister, and her exile arc ran quieter and further than any other. After the escape, she lived in Denmark, then ran a small dairy farm near Copenhagen with her second husband and their children. In 1948, fearing the advance of Soviet influence, she emigrated to Canada, first to a house near Toronto, then to a modest property near Campbellville, Ontario. She painted more than 2,000 works over her lifetime, selling many of them to supplement the family income. She died in 1960, aged 78, in a flat above a barbershop in Toronto. The youngest sister of the last Tsar of Russia ended her life in suburban Canada, painting flowers. Among the younger generation, the fates sharpened the outline's central question even further. Prince Feodor Alexandrovich, Zinnia's son, born in 1898, escaped on HMS Marlborough with his mother and grandmother. In Paris, he worked as a taxi driver. Later, he trained and practiced as an architect. He died in 1968. Princess Natalia Paley, born in 1905, the daughter of Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich by his morganatic second marriage, was technically excluded from full dynastic status by the circumstances of her parents' union. That exclusion may have freed her. She became a fashion model, actress, and socialite in Paris, and later New York, a woman who turned the Romanov name not into a burden, but into a brand, navigating the 20th century's appetite for aristocratic reinvention with a skill that her more formerly royal relatives could not match. Prince Vasily Alexandrovich, another of Xenia's sons, left Europe for America and worked as a cabin boy, a shipyard laborer, a stockbroker, a winemaker, and a chicken farmer in California. Each of these lives answers the question in the title differently. There was no single Romanov exile. There were dozens, and they diverged as sharply as the people living them. The dynasty's best years, the years that the documentary must render before it can honestly show the collapse, were shaped by all of these relationships and all of these tensions. The marriages created the later escape routes, Xenia's connection to Britain, the Paul line's path through Romania and France, Kirill's Finnish and German transit, Olga's Danish refuge. The court scandals planted the seeds of the later family divisions, morganatic marriages contested, love affairs tolerated but resented, a hierarchy of legitimacy that would continue to matter long after the hierarchy itself had lost all legal force. The 1913 tercentenary, with its diamonds and processions, and 3 centuries of self-congratulation, was the facade at its most polished. Behind it, the family was already a collection of branches with different priorities, different standards of discipline, and different abilities to adapt to a world that was about to change more violently than any of them could imagine. That world was at war by August 1914, and the war would prove to be the solvent that dissolved every certainty the Romanovs had ever possessed. The Romanovs entered the 20th century as Europe's grandest and most internally contradictory dynasty. To a British audience familiar with the quiet, constitutional rhythms of the House of Windsor, the scale of the Romanov operation requires a deliberate recalibration. This was not a family that reigned symbolically while Parliament governed. This was a family that was the government, an autocracy in which the Tsar's word was, at least in theory, absolute, and in which the extended family's access to land, income, military command, and social prestige depended entirely on the continuation of that autocratic structure. When the structure vanished, the access vanished with it. There was no fallback. There was no trust fund managed by discreet solicitors in Lincoln's Inn. There was only the empire, and then the empire was gone. The internal dynamics of the family before the revolution were already strained in ways that the formal photographs concealed. Xenia's marriage to Sandro had begun with affection and deteriorated into something more functional than romantic. Sandro was brilliant in conversation, well-connected among foreign navies, and capable of diagnosing Russia's political illnesses with a physician's precision. But he lacked the temperament or the position to prescribe cures. He kept mistresses. Xenia kept her faith and her composure. Their 7 children grew up inside a household where parental warmth was uneven and imperial expectation was constant. The boys were trained for military careers that would never materialize. The family's Crimean estate at Aitador, with its vineyards and its views of the Black Sea, functioned as both refuge and stage, a place where the Romanovs could be simultaneously grand and domestic. As long as the system that paid for the grandeur survived, it would not survive. Dmitry Pavlovich's early life read like a catalogue of the dynasty's internal cruelties. His mother, Alexandra of Greece, died 6 days after giving birth to him. His father Paul remarried without imperial permission, a transgression that carried real consequences in a court where the sovereign's approval of family unions was not ceremonial but legally binding. Paul was exiled from Russia for a period, and Dmitry and his sister Maria Pavlovna were placed in the care of their uncle Sergei and his wife, the Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna. Sergei was rigid, austere, and by most accounts emotionally withholding. Elizabeth was devout and compassionate, but occupied with her own spiritual trajectory, which would eventually lead her to found a religious order. The children grew up loved by some members of the family and neglected by others, insulated from ordinary childhood and exposed to the particular loneliness of imperial children raised by delegation. When Sergei was blown apart by a revolutionary's bomb in 1905, Dmitry was 13 years old. The death of his substitute father added another rupture to a childhood already defined by them. Maria Pavlovna, 1 year older than Dmitry, experienced the same dislocations, but processed them differently. Where Dmitri became charming and adrift, Maria became observant and sharp. She married Prince William of Sweden in 1908, a union that pleased the diplomatic charts, but not the two people inside it. The marriage lasted 5 years. Maria returned to Russia, divorced, and spent the war years doing nursing work that gave her, for the first time, contact with a world beyond court ritual. She would later write that the war taught her things about ordinary Russian life that her upbringing had been specifically designed to prevent her from learning. That education would prove more useful than anything else she carried into exile. Kirill Vladimirovich's pre-revolutionary career illustrated a different facet of the dynasty's internal contradictions. The Vladimir branch of the family, Kirill, his brothers Boris and Andrei, and their formidable mother, Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna the Elder, occupied a position of extraordinary social magnificence in St. Petersburg. The Vladimir Palace was famous for its entertainments. Maria Pavlovna the Elder was considered the most powerful hostess in the capital, a woman whose ambitions for her sons extended well beyond the conventional expectations of Romanov respectability. Kirill's marriage to Victoria Melita in 1905, contracted without Nicholas II's consent and initially punished with the loss of Kirill's titles and income, was eventually forgiven. But the episode left a residue of grievance between the branches that would harden in exile into open rivalry. Victoria Melita was strong-willed, ambitious, and convinced that Kirill's claim to headship of the dynasty was not merely valid but obligatory. That conviction would shape the family's exile politics for generations. Andrei Vladimirovich was the brother who followed pleasure rather than politics. His long relationship with Kshesinska was one of the worst-kept secrets in St. Petersburg, a city that treated the liaisons of Grand Dukes with a tolerance that bordered on indifference as long as the forms were maintained. Kshesinska herself was a phenomenon, a dancer of extraordinary ability who had risen from the Imperial Ballet School to become the most celebrated performer in Russia, amassing a fortune, a mansion, jewels, and the intimate attention of at least 2 Romanov Grand Dukes in the process. She bore a son, Vladimir, known as Vova, whose paternity was disputed between Andrei and his cousin, Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich. That ambiguity, which would have destroyed a less formidable woman, Kshesinska managed with the same precision she brought to her pirouettes. She was not sentimental about the dynasty. She was practical about what it could provide and relentless about protecting what she had earned. In exile, those qualities would make her one of the few people in this story who succeeded in building something durable out of the wreckage. Olga Alexandrovna, the quietest of the surviving senior Romanovs, had already defied family expectations before the revolution made defiance irrelevant. Her first marriage, to Prince Peter of Oldenburg in 1901, was widely understood within the family to have been unconsummated. Peter was either uninterested in women or incapable of intimacy with his wife. The historical record is discreet on the specifics. Olga endured the marriage for 15 years before it was annulled, and in 1916 she married Nikolai Kulikovsky, a commoner and a cavalry officer she had loved for more than a decade. That second marriage was happy but socially diminishing. Olga had chosen love over status, and the dynasty's internal code, even in its final months, registered the choice as step down. In exile, that step down became an advantage. Olga and Kulikovsky were less encumbered by the expectations that paralyzed grander relatives. They could farm. They could live modestly without the psychic violence of a fall from great height, because Olga had already voluntarily descended before the revolution pushed everyone else off the cliff. Among the younger generation, the Romanovs who were children or teenagers when the world ended would carry the dynasty's afterlife into the middle and late 20th century. Prince Feodor, born in 1898, was old enough to have absorbed the manners and assumptions of the old regime, but young enough to have no established career, no independent income, and no practical skills when exile began. His trajectory, taxi driver, then architect, is the clearest single illustration of what happened when imperial childhood met the employment market of interwar Paris. Natalia Paley, born in 1905, was younger still, and her morganatic status gave her a freedom that full-blooded Romanovs did not possess. She could reinvent herself without the weight of a legitimate claim. She could model, act, marry a couturier, move to America, and treat the Romanov connection as texture rather than obligation. Prince Vasily Alexandrovich, another of Xenia's sons, took the most radical path of all, leaving Europe entirely, crossing the Atlantic, and building an American life through manual labor, business ventures, and the kind of self-reliance that the old court would have found incomprehensible in a prince of the blood. These were the people who would survive. These were the threads the revolution would unspool but not sever. And the world they inhabited together in the Crimean summers, the Danish visits, the London cousins, the St. Petersburg seasons, the court uniforms, the imperial trains, the marriages arranged and the marriages resisted, was about to be destroyed with a speed that none of them, not even the most politically astute, fully anticipated. The war came first, and then the revolution, and then the killing. And the Romanovs who lived through all three of those things would discover that surviving was not the same as being saved. But before the destruction, there was the illusion of safety, and the illusion was, by any measure, magnificent. The Romanov family at its height occupied a social universe that combined the ceremonial weight of Versailles with the geographic immensity of Russia itself. Court life in St. Petersburg ran according to a calendar of balls, receptions, military reviews, and religious observances that had barely changed in a century. The women wore diamonds that other European courts considered excessive. The men wore uniforms encrusted with decorations that marked every ancestor's military service, going back generations. Servants numbered in the hundreds at the larger residences. A Grand Duchess traveling from St. Petersburg to her Crimean estate required a private railway carriage, a retinue, a wardrobe appropriate to the change of climate, and an assumption never questioned, because to question it would have been to question the structure itself, that all of this would continue. The Crimean estates mattered particularly because it was in Crimea that the surviving family would spend its last months on Russian soil. Xenia and Sandro's Aitador, perched above the Black Sea near Yalta, was a villa of gardens, terraces, and light, a place where the children could swim, and the adults could pretend that the political storms in the capital were meteorological rather than structural. Nearby sat Dolber, the Moorish fantasy palace built by Grand Duke Peter Nikolaevich, and the other Romanov properties that dotted the southern coast like a chain of imperial outposts. In better years, the family gathered there for summers that combined informality with an awareness of rank so deeply ingrained that it shaped the seating at every meal. The children played together. The adults maintained alliances, nursed grievances, and observed the hierarchy. Photographs from these Crimean gatherings show groups of people in white summer clothes, squinting into the sunlight, surrounded by gardens and children and dogs. They look relaxed. They look permanent. They were neither. The marriages that connected the Romanovs to the rest of European royalty created a network that would later function as an escape route. But in the years before the war, it served a different purpose. It made the dynasty feel universal. Xenia's marriage tied the family to the Mikhailovich branch, and through it to various European connections. Olga's second marriage was domestic and private. Kirill's marriage linked the Vladimirovich branch to the houses of Saxe-Coburg and Edinburgh. Dmitri and Maria Pavlovna were connected through their mother to the Greek royal house. And the central link was the marriage of Nicholas II to Alex of Hesse, granddaughter of Queen Victoria, placed the Russian imperial family at the heart of the European royal web. Every Christmas, every family funeral, every coronation and jubilee reinforced the idea that these dynasties were a single organism, bound by blood and sustained by mutual recognition. The idea was comforting. It was also, as events would prove, insufficient. When the Romanovs needed rescue, the web held for some of them and broke for others, and the pattern of who was saved and who was abandoned would leave scars that outlasted the empire by decades. The first signals of danger arrived not as revolution, but as embarrassment. Rasputin's presence at court, the whispered stories of his influence over the empress, the sense among the wider family that Nicholas was mismanaging both the war and his own household, these were not secrets. The Romanov relatives discussed them openly among themselves and occasionally tried to intervene. Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, Alexandra's own sister, attempted to warn her. The Dowager Empress made her displeasure known. Sandra wrote letters. Dmitri, as we have seen, went further. But none of it was enough, because the problem was not simply one man's influence. The problem was that the autocracy had produced a sovereign who could not govern and a court that could not correct him without undermining the principle on which all of their positions depended. The Romanovs were trapped by their own system. To save the dynasty, they would have had to challenge the Tsar. To challenge the Tsar was to challenge the dynasty. There was no exit that did not involve self-destruction, so the family watched, worried, complained to one another in drawing rooms and letters. and waited for a crisis they could feel approaching but could not prevent. That crisis had already begun. The war was consuming Russia. Defeats, supply failures, and staggering casualties were eroding public faith in the government. Nicholas's decision to assume personal command of the army in 1915 compounded the problem by tying the dynasty's prestige directly to military outcomes that were increasingly disastrous. At home, the Empress's reliance on Rasputin, real or exaggerated, gave the opposition a target that combined political grievance with sexual scandal in a combination that autocracies rarely survive. The family that had celebrated 300 years of unbroken rule in 1913 was losing control of the narrative by 1916. And behind the public crisis, the private one was deepening. Family members who disagreed about Rasputin disagreed about everything else as well, about the war, about reform, about the future, about whether Nicholas could be persuaded or needed to be replaced. The bonds that held the dynasty together were fraying under pressure that the dynasty's own structure made it impossible to relieve. By the end of 1916, the court was toxic. The murder of Rasputin in December, carried out in the basement of the Yusupov Palace by Prince Felix Yusupov, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, and others, this solved nothing and accelerated everything. Dmitry's banishment to the Persian front removed him from the capital, and as it turned out, from the revolution's killing zone. But the murder itself demonstrated that the family's internal mechanisms of self-correction had broken down to the point where assassination had replaced persuasion. The Romanovs were not yet at the mercy of the revolutionaries. They were at the mercy of their own dysfunction. That dysfunction would be overwhelmed within months by something far larger and far less manageable. The February Revolution of 1917 forced Nicholas II's abdication. The 300-year dynasty ended not with a foreign invasion, but with a domestic collapse so rapid that many family members learned of it through rumor, telegram, and second-hand report. The reaction within the wider family was not uniform. Some had anticipated it, some were stunned. Some felt a guilty relief that the mismanagement might finally be addressed. Almost none of them grasped in those early weeks what abdication would actually mean for them personally. Titles still existed in speech. Habits continued. Letters still carried the old forms and the old assumptions. But the legal reality had vanished overnight. They were no longer the imperial family. They were a family in danger, and the danger was about to become mortal. If this story has you as captivated as I think it has, do subscribe. What happened next to this family is something the public never knew. And we're only just beginning. The abdication of Nicholas II on March 15, 1917, changed the legal status of every Romanov in Russia, but it did not change their habits overnight. The family's immediate response to the end of the monarchy was shaped less by political analysis than by the deeply ingrained assumption that the world they had known would in some form return. Provisional government, republic, constitutional reform. These were ideas that the wider family could discuss, debate, even cautiously support, as long as the discussion took place inside a framework of personal safety and continued social standing. That framework was already dissolving. But the Romanovs, trained by 3 centuries of deference and self-regard, were slow to feel the ground shifting beneath them. In the first months after the abdication, the surviving branches of the family found themselves in different places and different degrees of danger. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were under house arrest at Tsarskoye Selo and later moved to Tobolsk in Siberia, a relocation that the wider family could do nothing to prevent and could only follow through fragmentary, unreliable reports. The Dowager Empress and her daughters Zenia and Olga were in Crimea, along with Sandro, several of the younger princes, and a household of servants and retainers whose loyalty now existed outside any institutional structure. Dmitry Pavlovich was already abroad, exiled after the Rasputin affair. Maria Pavlovna was in the process of extracting herself through Ukraine. Kirill Vladimirovich, who had initially appeared at the Duma wearing a red ribbon, a gesture that some family members viewed as opportunistic betrayal, was moving toward Finland. The family was scattering, not yet in flight, not yet in terror, but no longer gathered in one place, no longer held together by the gravitational force of the crown. The crown was gone, the gravity was gone. Each branch was beginning to drift according to its own weight and trajectory. In Crimea, the drift took the form of a long, suspended waiting. The estates at Aitador and Dolber, which had been summer retreats, became year-round residences occupied by people who had nowhere else to go. The Dowager Empress refused to believe that the situation was permanent. She maintained her routines, her household discipline, her expectation of deference, as though the continuation of manners might somehow will the continuation of the regime. Letters from this period, where they survive, show a mixture of composure and bewilderment, the voice of a woman who knows how to behave in a crisis, but has never experienced a crisis in which behavior itself has become irrelevant. Zinnia managed the household, worried about her son, wrote to contacts in the wider royal world, and tried to distinguish between rumors and facts in an information environment that offered precious little of the latter. Sandro analyzed the situation with his usual combination of intelligence and impotence. The younger princes, Feodor, Nikita, Dmitri Alexandrovich, Rostislav, Vasily, and Andrei, occupied themselves as young men do when their futures have been cancelled. They waited, they exercised, they tried not to think too carefully about what was coming. What was coming arrived in stages. The provisional government's authority over Crimea was never complete, and its replacement by Bolshevik and then briefly by German and Allied influenced arrangements created a kaleidoscope of local power structures in which the Romanovs' safety depended less on policy than on the temperament of whichever commander happened to be in charge. At certain points, armed men appeared at the gates. At other points, the family was left more or less alone. The uncertainty was itself a form of violence. The constant grinding awareness that the calculation of their safety was being made by strangers with no particular reason to protect them and some possible incentive to harm them. The old world had insulated the Romanovs from uncertainty. That insulation had been removed. What remained was the raw experience of not knowing, from one week to the next, whether the people in charge of their district intended to guard them, imprison them, or kill them. During this period, the question of British rescue entered the family's consciousness, and it is at this point that the story acquires one of its most painful dimensions. King George V was Nicholas II's first cousin. The physical resemblance between the two men was uncanny. The family connection was intimate, and in the early weeks after the abdication, the British government, under Prime Minister David Lloyd George, did extend an offer of asylum to the former Tsar and his family. That offer was then effectively withdrawn, not by a single dramatic act of betrayal, but through a process of constitutional anxiety, political calculation, and personal caution in which George V's private secretary, Lord Stamfordham, communicated the king's concerns about the political risks of sheltering the deposed autocrat. The precise degree of George V's personal responsibility remains a matter of historical debate. Helen Rappaport's research makes clear that the failure to save Nicholas was not simply one king losing his nerve. British constitutional limits, domestic politics, the labor movement's hostility to Russian autocracy, and the practical difficulties of extraction from Siberia all played a part. But the emotional fact that cousin abandoned cousin, and the abandonment ended in murder, would haunt the British royal family for generations and would shape the Romanov survivors' understanding of what British kinship actually meant. It meant shelter for some. It meant dependency for others. It did not mean unconditional solidarity. The survivors would learn that lesson repeatedly in the decades that followed. While the asylum question was being decided in London by people who would never face its consequences, the Romanovs in Crimea were living inside its consequences daily. The war had not ended. The revolution had not stabilized. The family occupied an increasingly narrow strip of safety between forces that regarded them with hostility, indifference, or, in the case of some local commanders, a residual deference that could evaporate overnight. The German advance into Ukraine and Crimea in 1918 briefly created a new set of protectors, but the protection was contingent and temporary. The Romanovs were not citizens. They were not refugees in any legally defined sense. They were the remains of a regime that had been violently replaced, and their continued existence was tolerated rather than guaranteed. This tolerance had limits, and the limits were about to be demonstrated with a brutality that would transform the family's situation from uncertain to desperate. In the summer of 1918, the killing began. On June 13, 1918, Grand Duke Michael Alexandrovich, Nicholas II's brother, the man to whom Nicholas had initially abdicated, was taken from his place of exile in Perm and shot by Bolshevik agents. His body was hidden. The confirmation of his death took time to reach the rest of the family, and when it arrived as rumor rather than official notification. The Romanovs in Crimea absorbed the news without ceremony, because there was no ceremony left. There was only the fact. On the night of July 17, 1918, Nicholas II, Alexandra, and their 5 children, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and Alexei, were murdered in the basement of the Ipatiev house in Ekaterinburg. The killings were carried out by a squad of Bolshevik executioners. The bodies were mutilated, burned, and buried in a forest. The news took weeks to filter through to the surviving relatives, and for some, including the Dowager Empress, full acceptance of the murders would never come. Maria Feodorovna would go to her grave, refusing, at least publicly, to concede that her son and his entire family had been slaughtered. Whether that refusal constituted genuine hope, willful denial, or a psychological defense against a grief too large to admit is something that belongs to her alone. The historical record offers evidence for all 3 readings, and settles none of them. The Ekaterinburg murders were not isolated. On July 18th, the day after the Tsar's family was killed, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Feodorovna, the widow of the assassinated Grand Duke Sergei, the woman who had helped raise Dmitri and Maria Pavlovna, was thrown alive into a mine shaft near Alipevsk, along with several other Romanov relatives. Among those murdered alongside Elizabeth were Grand Duke Sergei Mikhailovich, Prince Ewan Konstantinovich, Prince Konstantin Konstantinovich, Prince Igor Konstantinovich, and Prince Vladimir Paley, Natalia Paley's half-brother, a poet of 20 years old. Some of the victims were still alive when grenades were thrown in after them. Elizabeth Feodorovna, according to witnesses who later recovered the bodies, survived the fall and was heard singing hymns in the darkness before she died. In January 1919, Grand Duke Paul Alexandrovich, Dmitri and Maria Pavlovna's father, was executed by firing squad at the Peter and Paul fortress in Petrograd, along with Grand Dukes Nikolai Mikhailovich, Dmitri Konstantinovich, and George Mikhailovich. The killing of Paul struck at the hearts of 2 of this story's central figures. Dmitri learned of his father's death in exile. Maria Pavlovna learned of it while trying to build a new life in a country that was not her own. Both carried the knowledge forward into decades of displacement, reinvention, and private mourning conducted without the rituals or the support structures that grief traditionally requires. There is something about the sequence of these killings that needs to be stated plainly, because the documentary's emotional power depends on the viewer understanding what the survivors were processing. These were not casualties of a single event. They were notifications arriving one after another over the course of months. Michael in June, Nicholas and his family in July, Elizabeth and the Alipayevsk group in July, Paul and others in January. For the Romanovs in Crimea, each notification removed another branch from the family tree. Each one recalibrated the danger, and each one made the question of escape more urgent and more terrifying, because by the winter of 1918, it was clear that the Bolsheviks were not confining themselves to political neutralization. They were pursuing physical elimination. The dynasty was being pruned with a blade. The survivors in Crimea responded differently to the tightening vice. The Dowager Empress maintained her refusal to accept the worst of the news, a position that required immense psychological energy and that isolated her from family members who had already begun to grieve. Zenia's focus narrowed to her children and to the question of how to get them out. Olga drew closer to her husband and her immediate household. The younger princess oscillated between fear and the kind of forced nonchalance that young men adopt when they cannot control their circumstances and do not wish to appear helpless. Sandro, who understood political systems better than most people in the family, understood that the system currently in power had no structural reason to keep them alive. He also understood, and this is the detail that makes his situation particularly agonizing, that understanding the danger did not equip him to escape it. Knowledge without the means to act on it is its own torment, and yet improbably escape did come. Not through Romanov ingenuity or political negotiation, through the intervention of a foreign navy acting on the orders of a foreign crown, the very crown that had failed to save Nicholas and his children. In the early months of 1919, as the military situation in Crimea deteriorated again and the Bolshevik advance threatened to reach the southern coast, the British government authorized a naval evacuation. The decision was not sentimental, it was strategic, political, and partly dynastic. Queen Alexandra, the Dowager Empress's sister, had lobbied fiercely for her rescue, and the embarrassment of having already failed to save one branch of the family made the abandonment of another politically untenable. His Majesty's ship Marlborough, a battleship of the Iron Duke class, was dispatched to Yalta with orders to embark the Dowager Empress and her immediate family. The ship was coming. But what the ship carried away from the coast of Crimea was not merely a collection of titled refugees. It was the remnant of a dynasty that had been violently dismembered, psychologically shattered, and stripped of every institutional support it had ever known. The people who boarded Marlborough in April 1919 were alive. They carried titles, habits, some jewels, and a great deal of grief. They did not know where they were going to live. They did not know how they were going to eat. They did not know that they would never see Russia again. What they did know, by then, was that survival was not the same as rescue. And what none of them yet understood was that the decades ahead would prove it. To understand the full weight of what was happening to the Romanovs in this period, you have to track the individual threads. Because the experience of the revolution was not a single shared catastrophe. It was a series of overlapping private catastrophes, and each member of the family lived through a different version of the same destruction. For Dmitry Pavlovich, the revolution arrived at a distance. His banishment after the Rasputin murder had placed him first on the Persian front, and then, as the old army disintegrated, in a series of temporary locations from which he watched the empire collapse by telegram and hearsay. He was 25 years old when the Tsar abdicated. He had been raised in palaces, educated by tutors, trained for military command in an army that no longer existed, and accustomed to a social world in which his title opened every door. That world had closed. Dmitry found his way to London, where he lived for a time on the hospitality of British connections, spending evenings in society that regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and pity. The young Grand Duke, handsome and displaced, a relic of the old world at the dinner tables of the new one. He had charm. He had manners. He had no profession, no income, and no plausible future in the country where his title had once meant everything. London was kind to him in the way that London is kind to aristocratic refugees, socially inclusive, materially indifferent. He could dine out for years. He could not build a life on dinner invitations. Maria Pavlovna's escape was harder and more instructive. When the revolution began, she was in Russia. Her route out took her through Ukraine, through danger, through a series of temporary shelters and improvised border crossings that bore no resemblance to the cushioned travel she had known as a Grand Duchess. She arrived in Bucharest, then moved to London, then to Paris. At each stage, she shed another layer of the imperial identity that had defined her childhood. In Bucharest, she still had connections. In London, she had family acquaintances and a title that opened certain doors. In Paris, she had herself, her intelligence, her eye, her ability to work, and the growing realization that the old world was not going to reconvene. She was 30 years old. She had never earned money. She was about to learn. Kirill Vladimirovich's trajectory carried him through Finland to Germany and eventually to France, but his journey was shaped less by geography than by ambition. Where other family members experienced the revolution as a personal tragedy and responded with grief, adaptation, or retreat, Kirill experienced it as a dynastic succession crisis and responded with a political claim. His logic was not irrational. If Nicholas was dead, if Michael was dead, if Alexei was dead, then the headship of the imperial house passed by the dynasty's own laws through the male line. And Kirill stood near the front of that line. His proclamation of himself as head of the imperial house in 1922 and his subsequent assumption of the title emperor in exile in 1924 appalled some family members, energized others, and created a division that has never been fully resolved. The Dowager Empress refused to recognize the claim. Zinnia was opposed, Olga was uninterested. But Kirill and his wife, Victoria Melita, pursued the cause with conviction, settling at a villa in Saint-Briac in Brittany and maintaining a miniature court that was simultaneously absurd and poignant. A performance of sovereignty conducted in a French seaside town by a man whose empire existed only in his own constitutional imagination. The family dynamics during this period of dispersal was shaped by an absence that weighed more heavily than any presence. The absence was Nicholas, not merely as a relative, but as the point around which the entire family system had been organized. For 3 centuries, the Romanov world had revolved around the Tsar. The Tsar determined rank, approved marriages, dispensed income, arbitrated disputes, and embodied the principle of order around which every other family role was defined. With Nicholas gone, the family had no center. The Dowager Empress occupied the emotional center by force of personality, but she had no legal authority, no financial resources to distribute, and crucially, no agreement from the rest of the family about what their collective purpose now was. Were they a dynasty in exile, waiting for restoration? Were they a collection of individual refugees who happened to share a surname? Were they something in between? A family defined by what they had been rather than by what they were? The question was never formally answered, because to answer it would have required a unity that the old system's internal contradictions had made impossible. In its place, individual family members answered it for themselves, and the answers diverge. Andrei Vladimirovich and Kshasinska answered it through adaptation. Having left Russia with some of the jewelry and portable wealth that Kshasinska had accumulated during her years of imperial favor, they settled first on the French Riviera, where Andrei's gambling at the Casino de Monte Carlo consumed a significant portion of whatever capital they had preserved. The crash of 1929 finished what gambling had started. By the early 1930s, they had moved to Paris, where Kshasinska's reputation as the greatest ballerina of her generation became for the first time in her life a professional asset rather than a social ornament. She opened a ballet school on the Rue de Commandant Schlossing, and for the next 4 decades she taught the discipline that had once made her famous to students who had no memory of the world that had produced her. Among her pupils were members of the next generation of European ballet. The school sustained the family. It also preserved something less tangible, a transmission of technique and taste from the imperial world into the modern one, carried through the body of a woman who had once danced for czars and was now teaching in a rented studio to pay the rent. Olga Alexandrovna's answer was quieter. In Crimea, then in transit, and then in Denmark, she drew closer to domestic life and further from the dynasty's collective anguish. Denmark was safe. It was small. It was the homeland of her mother, and the Danish royal family provided a degree of support that, while modest, was more reliable than anything the British offered to the exiled branches that washed up in London. Olga and Kulikovsky settled on a farm near Copenhagen, and for the next 2 decades, Olga painted landscapes, flowers, still lifes, Russian scenes from memory, with a skill that was professional in quality and therapeutic in function. She sold her work through exhibitions and private sales. She did not paint for fame or for posterity. She painted because she could, because it earned money, and because the act of making something beautiful out of pigment and paper was a way of continuing to exist in a world that had destroyed every other structure she had known. The question of money dominated every branch of the exile story, and it is in the details of finance that the human cost becomes most concrete. Before the revolution, the Romanovs' wealth had been enormous but structurally vulnerable, tied to land, state income, court positions, and an economic system that assumed the permanence of the autocracy. When the autocracy fell, the wealth that was embedded in Russian land, Russian banks, and Russian government bonds became instantly inaccessible. What survived was portable, jewelry, some foreign bank deposits, personal possessions that could be sold. The Dowager Empress had jewels. Xenia had jewels. Kshasinska had jewels. Other family members had less. And for all of them, the sale of jewelry was not simply a financial transaction. It was a form of self-consumption, each sold piece reducing the tangible connection to a life that no longer existed. The process was slow, piecemeal, and socially humiliating. A Grand Duchess selling a diamond brooch in London was not a woman exercising financial prudence. She was a woman eating her own history to survive. The most famous single item to make this transition was the Vladimir tiara, one of the great jewels of the Romanov collection. It had belonged to Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna the Elder, Kirill's mother, and after her death in 1920, it passed through intermediaries and eventually into the collection of the British royal family, where Queen Mary purchased it. The tiara is still worn today by members of the House of Windsor. Its survival is a small, glittering emblem of the larger story, an object that crossed the gap between one dynasty and another, between a world that was destroyed and a world that absorbed its remnants. The tiara endured. The cord that made it did not. By the early 1920s, the Romanov diaspora had taken its permanent shape. The Dowager Empress was in Denmark, maintained by the Danish royal family and by the gradual sale of possessions. Xenia was in Britain, moving through a series of residences, first in the country, then at Frogmore Cottage in the grounds of Windsor Castle, provided by King George V. Dmitri was in Paris, living on reduced means and social connections. Maria Pavlovna was in Paris and London, beginning the improvised working life that would define her exile. Kirill was in France, building his claim. Andrei and Kshasinska were on the Riviera, then in Paris. Olga was in Denmark, farming and painting. The younger generation, Feodor, Vasily, Nikita, and the others, were scattered across the map, each one trying to answer the question of what a Romanov prince was supposed to do in a world that had no use for Romanov princes. The shape was permanent. The struggle was just beginning. and the next decade would show, with slow and particular cruelty, what survival actually cost the people who achieved it. The particular cruelty of Romanov exile, the thing that distinguishes it from other stories of fallen dynasties, was not poverty alone. Many of the survivors were not, by ordinary standards, poor. They had roofs, food, clothing, and in some cases the residual social capital of a famous name. What they lacked was purpose. The imperial system had given every Romanov a function: military command, charitable patronage, diplomatic marriage, court representation, and that function had vanished. The men were trained for commands that no longer existed. The women were trained for social roles in a society that had been replaced. The children were trained for futures that had been revoked. The result was a peculiar form of suffering that did not register on any conventional scale of hardship. They were not starving. They were not imprisoned. They were merely superfluous, and the experience of superfluity, for people raised to believe that their existence was nationally significant, constituted its own quiet devastation. Zinnia's adjustment to British life illustrated the paradox with painful clarity. In London, her title commanded social attention. She was invited to dinners, mentioned in court circulars, acknowledged as a figure of royal consequence by a British establishment that understood her precedence even if it could not restore her position. But behind the social facade, the reality was one of carefully managed dependence. George V provided Frogmore Cottage, a grace-and-favour residence in the grounds of Windsor, and an allowance that covered basic expenses. Zinnia was grateful. She was also, by every surviving account, conscious of the fundamental asymmetry of the arrangement. She was receiving charity from a cousin whose family had failed to save her brother. The gratitude and the resentment coexisted because they had to. There was no alternative. She could not afford to alienate her protectors, and she could not pretend that protection was the same as justice. Her son's situation made the asymmetry more visible. 7 young men, born into a family that had assumed their futures would include military distinction, advantageous marriages, and the continuation of the Romanov name under conditions of imperial security, were now dispersed across Europe with no careers, no capital, and no realistic prospect of restoring any of what they had lost. Some adapted, some did not. Feodor, as we have seen, drove a taxi in Paris. Nikita married a woman of means and found a degree of stability. Rostislav struggled. Vasily left for America. Andrei made his way with difficulty. Dmitry Alexandrovich, the youngest, lived quietly. Each of these trajectories represented a different answer to the same impossible question. What does a Romanov prince do when there is no Romanov empire? The range of answers, driver, exile, emigrant, society figure, worker, demonstrated that the family's internal diversity, which had been concealed by the uniformity of court life, became visible the moment the court disappeared. The Dowager Empress's final years in Denmark were shaped by a refusal that was both magnificent and self-destroying. She refused to accept that Nicholas and his children were dead. She refused to mourn them publicly. She refused to acknowledge the Bolshevik claim that the execution had taken place. That refusal gave her a kind of psychological armor, a way of continuing to exist inside a narrative in which the worst had not yet been confirmed. But it also isolated her from family members who had accepted the facts and were trying to grieve. There is no agreement among historians about whether Maria Feodorovna's refusal was strategic, emotional, or clinical. What is clear is that she maintained it consistently until her death, and that the cost of maintaining it, the constant vigilance against information that might breach the defense, the energy required to sustain a version of reality that most of the people around her had abandoned, was immense. She died on October 13th, 1928. She was 80 years old. She had outlived her husband, her eldest son, her grandchildren, and the empire she had entered as a young Danish bride in 1866. The question of what she privately believed about their fate died with her. Her death marked the end of the first generation of exile. The generation that had lived as imperial Russians, that had inhabited the palaces, attended the coronations, worn the diamonds without irony, and understood the court's social grammar from the inside, was giving way to a generation that had to construct identities from fragments. The Dowager Empress had been the last person alive who could credibly embody the old world simply by being present in a room. With her gone, the Romanov diaspora lost its emotional anchor and became what it would remain for the rest of the century, a collection of individuals managing a shared inheritance that was simultaneously famous and useless, prestigious and impoverishing, impossible to discard and impossible to live on. The 1930s would test that management to breaking point. The Depression destroyed whatever financial stability some branches had assembled. The rise of fascism offered some Russian émigrés a political home and others a political nightmare. The approach of another war threatened to repeat the pattern of the last one: disruption, displacement, the randomness of survival. And the Romanovs, who were still alive in 1939, would face all of it without the one thing their upbringing had taught them to expect: the certainty that somebody somewhere was responsible for their well-being. Nobody was. They were on their own. And what they did with that solitude. The work they found, the marriages they made, the children they raised, the compromises they accepted, and the losses they absorbed, is the answer to the question in this documentary's title. The addresses tell the story as efficiently as any narrative: before the Revolution, the Winter Palace, Aitodor, the Vladimir Palace, Gatchina, Tsarskoye Selo. After the Revolution, Frogmore Cottage, Wilderness House at Hampton Court, a flat in the 16th arrondissement, a villa at Saint-Briac, a studio on the Rue de Commandant Schleusing, a dairy farm near Copenhagen, a rented room in Boulogne-sur-Seine, a house near Campbellville, Ontario. The shrinkage in square footage was a form of violence that left no marks on the body but changed everything about how the survivors understood themselves in relation to the world. A palace confirms you. A rented room asks you to explain yourself. And the Romanovs, for the first time in 300 years, had no explanation that the world around them was obliged to accept. The first years of the 1920s were the years in which exile hardened from a temporary condition into a permanent one. Not because anyone made an announcement, not because a border closed or a law was passed, but because gradually the mental framework of return, the assumption that the Bolshevik regime would collapse, that the monarchy might be restored, that the old addresses might be reoccupied, was replaced by the understanding that this was life now. Paris, London, Copenhagen, Cannes, Saint-Briac. These were not waiting rooms. They were destinations, and the Romanovs who recognized that fact earliest were the ones who suffered least, because they could begin the work of adaptation before the full psychic weight of permanent displacement crushed the impulse to act. Maria Pavlovna recognized it first, and her adaptation became the most vivid single narrative in the exile story. In London in the early 1920s, she began knitting, not as a hobby, not as a pastime to fill the days between social calls. As a commercial enterprise, she made sweaters, dresses, and accessories, and she sold them to anyone who would buy: friends, acquaintances, shops that would take consignment work. The granddaughter of Alexander II was selling knitwear out of a rented room because the alternative was financial dependence on relatives whose own resources were shrinking. The work was physically demanding, socially uncomfortable, and emotionally clarifying. She later wrote that it taught her things about herself that the old life had made it impossible to learn, that she was capable, that she had taste, and that taste, when translated into product, could be exchanged for money. That last discovery was not trivial. For a woman raised to regard commerce as beneath her station, the realization that she could support herself through her own hands and her own judgment was revolutionary in its own quiet way. The political revolution had destroyed her world. The personal revolution of self-sufficiency began to build a new one. From knitwear, she progressed to embroidery, and from embroidery, she progressed to something more ambitious. In Paris, Maria Pavlovna established Kitmir, a workshop producing intricate Russian-style embroideries that she then supplied to the French fashion industry. The business grew quickly. Her clients included the House of Chanel, where her work was incorporated into designs that carried the cachet of Russian craft to a Parisian clientele besotted with everything Slavic. Coco Chanel herself, who had her own complicated relationship with Russian exile society through her affair with Grand Duke Dmitri, recognized quality when she saw it, and the collaboration between the Grand Duchess's atelier and the couturier's brand became one of the small, improbable success stories of the emigration. But success in the émigré economy was provisional. The embroidery market shifted, tastes changed, Chanel's own business model evolved. By the late 1920s, the initial demand for Russian-inflected handwork had begun to wane, and Maria Pavlovna found herself doing what she had already done once before: pivoting, improvising, trying to convert cultural capital into commercial survival. She attempted a perfume, Prince Igor, hoping to capitalize on the vogue for Russian glamour, that her embroidery had helped to create. The perfume did not succeed. The attempt revealed both Maria Pavlovna's resilience and the fundamental fragility of exile entrepreneurship. Every venture depended on the continued marketability of a brand, Romanov, Russian, imperial, that was simultaneously her greatest asset and an increasingly antique proposition. The world wanted Russian style. It did not necessarily want it from an actual Russian Grand Duchess living in a modest Parisian flat. Maria Pavlovna's personal losses compounded the professional ones. Her young son Roman, born from her second marriage to Prince Sergei Putyatyn, died in childhood. The death broke something in her that the revolution had only bent. She later described the loss in terms that make clear it was qualitatively different from the other losses she had endured. The death of a child is not the same as the death of an empire, even for a woman who had experienced both. She continued working, she continued living, but the woman who emerged from that grief was harder, more guarded, and more privately devastated than the resourceful émigré the public saw. She died in 1958 in a Romanov afterlife that had included exile, labor, artistic achievement, commercial failure, and a capacity for honest self-description that none of her male relatives could match. Dmitri Pavlovich's Paris years ran parallel to Maria's, but in a different register entirely. Where his sister worked, Dmitri drifted. He had charm, looks, and a title that still opened certain doors in a city where titles from abolished monarchies carried a particular social currency, exotic enough to be interesting, powerless enough to be unthreatening. He lived in hotels and rented flats. He maintained a social presence at parties, restaurants, and the kind of gatherings where émigré aristocrats mingled with Parisian bohemians, American expatriates, and the occasional visiting journalist in search of color. His most publicly discussed relationship was with Coco Chanel, whom he met in 1921 through Grand Duke Dimitri's cousin and who became, for a period, his lover, his patron, and his introduction to a world in which talent and money operated independently of birth. The relationship did not last. Chanel was self-made, ambitious, and ruthless. Dmitri was hereditary, passive, and lost. The combination was electric for a season and unsustainable beyond it. Chanel later said that Dmitri was one of the few men she had known who was truly elegant. She did not say he was one of the few who was useful. In 1926, Dmitri married Audrey Emery, a wealthy American whose fortune offered the kind of financial stability that Dmitri could never have generated on his own. The marriage produced a son, Paul Romanovsky-Ilinsky, born in London in 1928. For a time, the arrangement worked. Audrey's money covered the expenses, Dmitri's title provided the social credentials, and the couple lived with a version of the comfort that Dmitri's upbringing had led him to regard as normal. But the comfort was purchased, not earned, and the dynamic it created was corrosive. Dmitri was dependent on his wife's income. Audrey was tolerant of his dependency. The marriage survived for a decade before ending in divorce. By the late 1930s, Dmitri's health was declining. He had been diagnosed with tuberculosis. He spent his final years in a sanatorium in Davos, Switzerland, where the mountain air that was supposed to heal him merely slowed the dying. He was 50 years old when he died in March 1942. The Second World War was underway. The Europe that had received him as a refugee in 1917 was itself being destroyed. He had survived one catastrophe only to witness another, and the second one took him before it ended. The contrast between Dmitri's trajectory and Maria Pavlovna's, between his passivity and her industry, between his reliance on charm and her reliance on labor, is not accidental. It reflects a pattern that runs through the entire Romanov exile. The women adapted faster than the men, not always, not universally, but often enough to constitute a discernible tendency. Maria Pavlovna built Kitmir. Jasinska built a ballet school. Natalia Paley built a modeling and acting career. Olga Alexandrovna built a painting practice. In each case, a woman trained for decorative uselessness discovered that she possessed skills the modern world would pay for. The men, by contrast, were more often trapped between the ghost of military command and the reality of civilian irrelevance. They had been trained to let regiments. There were no regiments. They had been trained to administer estates. There were no estates. Some, like Feodor, found manual or professional work and got on with it. Others, like Dmitri, floated through the social world, that their names still opened, waiting for something that never came. Fyodor Alexandrovich's taxi driving years in Paris deserve particular attention because they correct the most persistent misunderstanding about Romanov exile. The popular imagination, shaped by films and novels, tends to picture exiled royals in two modes: tragic grandeur or comic opera pretension. The reality was neither. It was work. Fyodor drove a taxi because he needed income, and because a taxi driving license was obtainable in Paris by a young man with no professional qualifications and no French university degree. He was not performing ironic commentary on the fall of empire. He was paying his rent. Later, he studied architecture and practiced in that field, building a professional identity that owed nothing to his Romanov birth and everything to his post-Romanov effort. His life is the least dramatic thread in this story, and for that reason perhaps the most revealing. The taxi was not a symbol, it was a vehicle, and the man driving it was not a prince in disguise. He was a prince with a meter running. While the individual threads diverged, the collective family drama of the 1920s and 1930s was dominated by two forces: money and legitimacy. Money, because every branch was spending faster than it was earning, and because the sale of jewels and possessions, the family's emergency reserve, was a finite resource being drawn down against an infinite future. The Dowager Empress's remaining jewels, after her death in 1928, became the subject of negotiations between the Danish and British royal families that illustrated the awkward intersection of sentimentality and commerce that defined Romanov assets in exile. Xenia received a share. Olga received a share. The proceeds were welcome but insufficient. The diamond brooches and pearl ropes that had once been birthday gifts between empresses were now line items in household budgets managed by women who had never seen a household budget before 1917. Legitimacy, because Kirill Vladimirovich's claim to headship of the imperial house forced every other family member to take a position, and most of them took the position that Kirill was overstepping. The Dowager Empress rejected the claim before she died. Xenia rejected it. Olga was indifferent to it. The younger generation was divided. Kirill and Victoria Melita, undeterred, maintained their miniature court at Saint-Briac, issued decrees, received petitioners, and behaved in all respects as though the empire were temporarily suspended, rather than permanently destroyed. When Kirill died in 1938, his son Vladimir succeeded to the claim, and when Vladimir died in 1992, his daughter Maria Vladimirovna took it up. The claim survives today. It has not gained political traction. It has gained media attention and a website. Whether that constitutes dignity or delusion depends entirely on where you stand in the Romanov family's internal geography, a geography that nearly a century after the revolution remains contested. The 1930s thinned the family further. Sandro died in 1933 in the south of France, having spent his last years writing memoirs that combined political insight with personal regret. His death removed from the story one of the few people who had understood both the old world and its destruction with genuine analytical intelligence. Kirill died in 1938. Victoria Melita had preceded him in 1936. With each death, the generation that remembered the empire as adults diminished, and the generation that knew it only through childhood memory or family narrative became the dominant voice. That generational transition matters because it changed the nature of exile. The first generation mourned what they had lost. The second generation managed what they had inherited: a famous name, a contested legacy, a set of addresses scattered across Western Europe, and the irreducible problem of being Romanov in a world that had no use for Romanovs but continued to find them interesting. The Second World War disrupted even the modest stabilities that exile had created. The fall of France in 1940 placed the Paris Romanovs under German occupation. Kshesinska continued to teach. Maria Pavlovna, still in Paris, endured. Dmitri died in Switzerland. The London branch, Xenia and her diminished household, experienced the Blitz. The war added another layer of displacement to lives already defined by displacement, and it did so without the compensating drama of participation. The Romanovs were not combatants. They were not resistance fighters. They were civilians whose political significance had expired a generation earlier and whose personal significance was limited to the people who depended on them and the people who remembered what they had once represented. They endured the war the way millions of other Europeans endured it, by surviving, by waiting, and by hoping that what came after would be better than what was happening now. What came after, for most of them, was more of the same, but slower, quieter, and further from anyone's attention. And it is in that quietness, in the undramatic decades of the 1940s and 1950s, that the final answer to this documentary's question takes its shape. The specific mechanics of daily exile were rarely grand enough for cinema, but devastating enough for life. Zenia Alexandrovna's years at Frogmore Cottage and then a wilderness house in the grounds of a Hampton Court palace constituted a unique experiment in domesticated royalty. She was not exactly a guest. She was not exactly a resident in the usual sense. She was a Romanov living inside the British Crown's property system under conditions that were simultaneously generous and subordinating. George V had provided the accommodation out of family loyalty, and one suspects out of the unspoken guilt that hung over the British monarchy's failure to save Nicholas. When George V died in 1936, the arrangement continued under George VI, who moved Zinnia from Frogmore to Wilderness House, a handsome but smaller property at Hampton Court that became her home for the rest of her life. The interior of that life was modest by any standard, but by Romanov standards it was a study in compression. Zenia lived with a reduced household. She attended the Russian Orthodox Church in London. She received visitors who remembered the old world and visitors who were curious about it. She sold possessions when cash was short, a process she managed with the grim discretion of a woman who understood that each sale was visible to the social world around her and that visibility was its own humiliation. Her sons visited when they could. Her correspondence with other surviving relatives maintained the family's emotional connections across borders, languages, and decades. She was, by all accounts, dignified, devout, and privately lonely, a woman whose social skills had been developed for a world of 300 rooms and were now deployed in a world of 12. There is something about the image of Zinnia at Hampton Court that carries a larger meaning than her individual story. Hampton Court Palace is itself a monument to the transience of English royal favour, built by Cardinal Wolsey, taken by Henry VIII, inhabited and abandoned by successive monarchs, eventually opened to the public and to grace-and-favour residents whose presence testified to the crown's continuing capacity for both generosity and control. For the sister of the last Tsar to live out her final decades in a palace once associated with Henry VIII's matrimonial catastrophes was an irony that the British press occasionally noticed, but never fully explored. Zinnia did not comment on it, she was not given to commentary, she was given to endurance, and she endured until November 20th, 1960, when she died at Wilderness House at the age of 85. She had spent 41 years in exile. She had watched her children grow up without the world they had been promised, had outlived her mother, her brother, most of her generation, and the empire that had defined her. She left behind a small collection of personal possessions, a reputation for quiet courage, and the unanswerable question of what her life might have been if the cousin who looked like her brother had found a way to save him. Olga Alexandrovna's later years took the story in a direction that no Romanov of the pre-revolutionary generation could have predicted. After more than 2 decades in Denmark, years of farming, painting, quiet domesticity, and an increasing distance from the émigré world's social competitions, Olga and her husband Nikolai Kulikovsky made the decision, in 1948, to emigrate to Canada. The decision was driven partly by anxiety about Soviet influence in Europe, and partly by the practical recognition that Denmark, while safe, offered limited prospects for a growing family in straitened circumstances. Canada was large, English-speaking, and indifferent to European titles, qualities that, for Olga, represented not a loss but a relief. She had spent her adult life trying to shed the weight of her surname. Canada let her do it. The family settled first near Toronto, then on a farm near Campbellville, Ontario. Olga continued to paint. She had been prolific in Denmark, and in Canada, her output increased. Watercolors of flowers, landscapes, birds, and domestic scenes that combined technical accomplishment with a gentleness of vision that reflected, perhaps, the temperament she had cultivated as a defense against the violence of her history. She sold her work through small exhibitions and word of mouth. She was known locally as a painter, not as a princess. Her neighbors understood, in the way that Canadian neighbors of that era understood such things, that she had a background of some significance, but the significance was not pressed upon them, and they did not press back. Olga's Canadian years were, by every account, the closest thing to happiness that exile had given any member of her generation. She was away from the family quarrels. She was away from the legitimacy disputes. She was away from the soul jewels and the grace and favour arrangements and the social obligation to perform a status that no longer existed. She was a woman on a farm, painting flowers and raising her grandchildren. She was also the youngest sister of the last Tsar of all the Russias. Those two identities coexisted inside her without apparent conflict, because she had chosen to let the second one go. She did not go gently into that choice. She went deliberately. And the deliberateness is what makes her story, within this larger family saga, quietly powerful. Most of the Romanovs who survived clung to their identity because identity was all they had left. Olga released hers because she understood that what she had left meant husband, children, a craft, a home was enough. Kulikovsky died in 1958. Olga, increasingly frail, moved to a flat in Toronto. She died on November 24th, 1960, just 4 days after Zinnia's death in London, though neither sister knew the other was dying. The coincidence is not meaningful in any causal sense, but it carries a structural weight. The two surviving sisters of Nicholas II died within a week of each other, one in the grounds of an English palace and one in a flat above a barber shop in suburban Toronto, and each of them had spent 4 decades answering the same question. What do you do with a life that should have been lived inside an empire, in completely different ways? Zinnia answered with endurance. Olga answered with release. Neither answer was wrong. Neither was complete. They were simply the best responses available to women whose training had prepared them for everything except the lives they actually led. Natalia Paley's trajectory offered a third model, one that belonged more fully to the 20th century than to the 19th. Born in 1905, she was 14 when the revolution ended, and young enough to have no formed adult identity attached to the old regime. Her father's morganatic marriage placed her outside the strictest circle of dynastic legitimacy, which gave her social mobility that full-blooded Romanovs lacked. In Paris in the 1920s, she became a fashion figure, tall, striking, photographed by Horst and Heuning and Hine, dressed by the houses whose clientele she simultaneously inhabited and embodied. She married the couturier Lucien Lelong in 1927 and became a fixture of the Parisian world in which fashion, art, and aristocracy overlapped. After the marriage ended, she moved to New York, where she modeled, acted in films, and married the theatrical producer John Chapman Wilson. Her American years were glossy, socially prominent, and privately complicated. She suffered miscarriages that left her unable to have children, and her personal life was marked by the kind of elegant unhappiness that mid-century Manhattan cultivated as a style. Natalia Paley's significance to this story is not that she was the most successful Romanov exile. It is that she demonstrated a mode of survival that was unavailable to her older relatives. Reinvention, without apology. She did not mourn the empire. She did not claim headship of the dynasty. She did not sell jewels in dignified silence. She became someone new, a fashion model, a socialite, a modern woman. And she did it with a flair that transformed the Romanov name from a mark of dispossession into a mark of distinction. The Smithsonian's recent Hillwood exhibition on Natalia Paley explored this transformation in detail, and what it revealed was not simply a life of glamour, but a life of strategic self-creation, conducted by a woman who understood that the past could be curated as well as mourned. Prince Vasily Alexandrovich's American life was the least glamorous and in some ways the most remarkable. Zinnia's son left Europe and crossed the Atlantic not as a socialite seeking reinvention, but as a young man seeking work. In America, he held a succession of jobs that read like a catalog of immigrant labor: cabin boy, shipyard worker, stockbroker, winemaker, chicken farmer. He settled eventually in California, where the distance from European emigre society was geographical as well as psychological. He did not maintain a miniature court. He did not issue claims. He worked, married, and raised a family in a country where the surname Romanov meant less than a good credit rating and a willingness to show up a Monday morning. His life is the thread that stretches furthest from the St. Petersburg palaces and comes closest to the democratic anonymity that the revolution, in its original rhetoric, had claimed to pursue. There is an irony in that, in a Romanov prince living as an American worker, achieving through exile the classless existence that Bolshevism promised and failed to deliver. But the irony is incidental, not intentional. Vasily did not move to California to make a philosophical point. He moved there because it was far away and because there was work. Each of these trajectories, Zinnia's endurance, Olga's release, Maria Pavlovna's industry, Dmitri's drift, Feodor's taxi, Natalia's reinvention, Vasily's labor, answered the title's question in a different key. And by the middle of the 20th century, those answers had hardened into permanent patterns, each one as fixed and as individual as the personality that produced it. But there was one more act to play. The question of what the Romanov name meant, not to the individuals who carried it, but to the world that remembered it, was about to enter a new phase. And that phase would determine not what the survivors became, but what remained of them after they were gone. Kshesinska's ballet school on the Rue du Commandant Schlusing became over the decades something more than a survival strategy for one household. It became a channel through which imperial Russian culture flowed into the modern world. The school's pupils included dancers who would go on to perform with companies across Europe. Its method was rooted in the Vaganova tradition that Kshesinska had absorbed at the Imperial Ballet School in St. Petersburg, modified by decades of practical teaching experience and by the aesthetic instincts of a woman who had once been the most technically accomplished dancer in Russia. She taught with discipline, with exactitude, and with a standard of physical perfection that some students found inspiring and others found brutal. She was not sentimental about the past, she was professional about the present, and the result was a body of pedagogical work that outlasted the political circumstances that had produced it. Andrei, meanwhile, occupied the role of the retired Grand Duke, with a consistency that bordered on caricature. He attended Kshesinska's recitals. He visited the Russian church. He maintained correspondence with other exiles. He did not work. The household's finances rested on Kshesinska's earnings, on whatever remained from the sale of earlier possessions, and on the occasional kindness of friends and former pupils. It was not by most measures a prosperous existence, but it was a stable one, anchored by Kshesinska's professionalism and sustained by the couple's mutual decision to live within their diminished means rather than chase the phantom of former grandeur. Andrei died in 1956. Kshesinska lived on until 1971, dying at the age of 99 in a Paris nursing home, the last living link to the pre-revolutionary Russian ballet world, and one of the last people alive who could remember dancing for a czar. The question of Romanov legitimacy, which Kirill had opened in the 1920s and which his son Vladimir continued to press through the middle decades of the century, created a fault line within the exile community that mirrored, in miniature, the larger historical question of what the Russian monarchy meant in the 20th century. On one side stood the legitimist position. The Romanov dynasty had laws of succession. Those laws survived the empire's destruction, and headship of the imperial house was a matter of legal right, not political power. On the other side stood the position represented by the Romanov Family Association, formed by descendants who rejected the legitimist claim and argued that no single branch could arrogate the whole dynasty's authority. The association, which would become the principal collective body for Romanov descendants, included members scattered across Britain, France, Spain, Italy, and the United States, a diaspora held together not by political ambition, but by genealogical fact and the shared experience of a surname that was simultaneously a burden and a bond. This division was not merely academic. It shaped marriages, social alliances, funeral arrangements, and the question of who was entitled to speak for the family in public. It also shaped the family's relationship with post-Soviet Russia, where the question of Romanov restoration surfaced periodically in the 1990s and 2000s without ever reaching political seriousness. Maria Vladimirovna, Kirill's granddaughter, maintained and continues to maintain an active claim to headship, complete with a website, public appearances, and the trappings of a royal household without a realm. The Romanov Family Association, for its part, has maintained its own organizational structure, its own roster of recognized descendants, and its own position that legitimacy resides not in one claimant, but in the collective. The dispute matters to this documentary not because it is likely to be resolved, it is not, but because it demonstrates that the exile did not end when the exiles died. The arguments they began continued in their children and grandchildren. The identity they tried to define, what it means to be Romanov after the Romanovs, remains undefined. And the energy that earlier generations spent on survival, on work, on selling jewels and driving taxis and teaching ballet, the next generation spent on a question that was simultaneously simpler and more intractable. Who are we now? That question echoed across every branch and every generation. For Dmitri's son, Paul Romanovsky-Ilyinsky, born in 1928, the answer involved becoming an American citizen and eventually serving as the mayor of Palm Beach, Florida, a trajectory that would have bewildered Dmitri's contemporaries and possibly amused Dmitri himself. For Zenia's granddaughter, Princess Olga Andreevna, born in 1950 and raised in Britain, the answer involved a public-facing role as a spokesperson for the family's history, a writer, and eventually the president of the Romanov Family Association. For each descendant, the question required a personal negotiation between the weight of the name and the demands of the life, a negotiation that the first generation of exiles had conducted under conditions of emergency and that later generations conducted under conditions of normality, which turned out to be its own kind of difficulty. The middle decades of the 20th century were, for most Romanov descendants, decades of consolidation. The great dramas, the murders, the escape, the first desperate years of exile were over. What remained was the long, undramatic work of building lives in countries that were not Russia and under identities that were not imperial. Children were raised, marriages were made, jobs were held, rent was paid. The family's public visibility dimmed as the generation that remembered the empire personally gave way to a generation that knew it only through photographs, letters, and the stories told at kitchen tables by grandparents who grew quieter as they aged. That quietness was not peace. It was exhaustion. The exhaustion of people who had spent their lives carrying an identity that the world could neither accommodate nor fully forget. And then, in the final decades of the century, something changed. The Soviet Union collapsed. Russia opened. The graves at Ekaterinburg were exhumed. The remains of Nicholas, Alexandra, and 3 of their children were identified through DNA analysis and reburied with state ceremony in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg in 1998. The Tsar, who had been murdered in a cellar, was given 80 years later the funeral he had been denied. The ceremony was attended by descendants. It was broadcast internationally. It was, for some members of the family, a moment of closure. For others, it reopened wounds that had never fully healed. And for the documentary viewer, it provides the bridge between the exile story and the present. The moment when the private grief of the Romanov family intersected once more with the public history of the country that had destroyed them. But before we reach the present, before we track where each surviving thread now rests, there is one more scene to render. The scene that should be the emotional centerpiece of this documentary, not because it contains the greatest violence, but because it contains the greatest weight. It is the morning of April 11th, 1919, in Yalta Harbor, and HMS Marlborough is preparing to depart. The story has now moved forward, through decades of exile, through Paris workshops and London drawing rooms and Canadian farms, through sold tiaras and ballet schools and taxicabs. But to understand the emotional architecture of the Romanov survivor story, to feel its weight rather than merely to know its facts, you have to return to the moment when exile began. Not as a gradual process of adjustment, but as a single, specific morning when the survivors of one of Europe's greatest dynasties stood on a quayside in Yalta and watched a British battleship wait for them. The morning of April 11th, 1919, was overcast in Yalta. The Black Sea stretched gray and flat beyond the harbor. On the quayside, the remnants of the Romanov court assembled for embarkation in a scene that combined the last vestiges of imperial ceremony with the humiliating practicalities of wartime evacuation. There were trunks, there were servants, there were the Dowager Empress's jewels, packed and guarded, the portable residue of an empire that had once stretched from Poland to the Pacific. There were naval officers in British uniforms, brisk and orderly, managing the logistics of getting a former imperial household aboard a warship designed for Atlantic combat, not for dynastic rescue. There were other evacuees, not all Romanov, not all royal, but all leaving Russia under the same shadow of violence and political collapse that had brought the empire down. HMS Marlborough was an Iron Duke-class battleship, 14,000 tons of steel and gun turrets, designed for the Grand Fleet and deployed to the Black Sea as part of the Allied intervention in the Russian Civil War. It was not a yacht. It was not a cruise liner. It was a weapon of war repurposed for one voyage as a lifeboat. The incongruity between the ship's function and the passengers it was carrying defined the entire scene. The Dowager Empress, who had last boarded a ship as the consort of an emperor, was boarding this one as a refugee. Her daughter Xenia, who had last left Crimea to travel by imperial train to St. Petersburg, was leaving Crimea this time by naval embarkation. The young princes, Feodor, Nikita, Rostislav, Vasily, Dmitry Alexandrovich, Andrei, were leaving a country they had been born to inherit and entering a future they had no vocabulary to describe. The embarkation was not disorderly. The British naval officers who managed it later wrote and spoke about the experience with a mixture of professional satisfaction and private bewilderment. They were accustomed to transporting soldiers, supplies, and ammunition. They were not accustomed to transporting a Dowager Empress who expected and received deference to her rank even as the rank's institutional basis had ceased to exist. The officers assigned cabins, managed space, arranged meals, and navigated the social protocol of a floating world in which Russian imperial hierarchy collided with British naval discipline. By all accounts, both sides managed the collision with more grace than might have been expected. The British deferred to the Empress. The empress deferred to the captain. The children and younger members of the party adapted to the ship's routines. The servants, whose own futures were at least as uncertain as their employers, maintained the forms of service that had structured their lives, because maintaining forms was better than acknowledging that the forms no longer meant what they had always meant. The Dowager Empress herself presented, throughout the embarkation, a figure of composure that concealed, or perhaps constituted, an extraordinary act of psychological management. She was 71 years old. Her eldest son and his entire family had been murdered. Other relatives had been killed or were unaccounted for. The country she had entered as a young bride in 1866, the country whose language, faith, and customs she had adopted with the thoroughness expected of a foreign-born consort, was now in the hands of a government that regarded her and everyone like her as enemies of the people. She was leaving not merely a residence, but a civilization, and she was doing it with the deportment of a woman attending a slightly inconvenient court function. Whether that deportment reflected genuine inner calm, trained imperial habit, or the kind of numbness that descends after grief has exceeded the mind's capacity to process, it is unknowable from the outside. What the British officers saw was a small, upright, elderly woman who behaved like a sovereign. What she felt was hers alone. The ship pulled away from the harbor. The coast of Crimea began to recede. Someone, the accounts do not specify who, watched the shoreline disappear and did not speak. The silence is the kind of detail that matters in documentary narration because it resists interpretation. It might have been grief, it might have been relief, it might have been the blank interval between one life and the next, the pause in which the organism that has been running from danger for months allows itself, for the first time, to stop. Whatever it was, it lasted only a moment. The ship moved, the coast thinned to a gray line. The gray line became mist, Russia was gone. Later, certificates were issued to the evacuees. These documents, preserved in archives and occasionally surfacing at auction, state in bureaucratic naval language that the bearer left Russia aboard HMS Marlborough on April 11, 1919. One such certificate, associated with Grand Duchess Maria, reduces the catastrophe of an empire to a single line of administrative facts: name, ship, date of departure. There is something about that reduction that deserves its own moment in the documentary. Not because the certificate is historically significant in isolation, but because it captures in a piece of paper the gap between what these people were and what they had become. They had been the imperial family of Russia. They were now the bearers of certificates attesting that they had left. The voyage to Malta took several days. The Marlborough stopped at Halki and then proceeded to Malta, where the British maintained a naval base that served briefly as a transit point for the Romanov evacuees. Malta was warm, British-administered, and utterly foreign to people whose geography had previously consisted of St. Petersburg, Crimea, Denmark, and the country estates that connected them. The Dowager Empress and her party stayed briefly before the family's destinations diverged. The Dowager Empress proceeded to England, and where Queen Alexandra, her sister, was waiting, and then to Denmark, where she would spend the remaining 9 years of her life. Xenia remained on a British trajectory, eventually reaching London and the series of residences that would define her exile. Other family members scattered to their own temporary shelters, beginning the process of converting transit into permanence. The first weeks in England were marked by the specific awkwardness of royal hospitality extended to royal refugees. The British court knew how to receive visiting sovereigns. It had protocols, precedents, and a social machinery refined over centuries. What it did not have was a protocol for receiving the deposed relatives of a murdered czar whose political situation made them simultaneously sympathetic and inconvenient. The Romanovs were family. They were also liabilities, potential magnets for émigré politics, potential embarrassments in Britain's evolving relationship with the new Russia, and potential drains on a royal household whose own finances, while secure, were not unlimited. The solution, arrived at gradually rather than announced, was a policy of discreet support. Housing would be provided, allowances would be given, and social acknowledgement would be maintained, but the Romanovs would be expected to live quietly, to avoid political entanglement, and to refrain from becoming a cause. It was generosity with conditions. It was shelter with limits. It was, for the people on the receiving end, better than the alternative and worse than what they had been raised to expect. Xenia navigated these limits with the skill of a woman who had spent her entire life inside social structures that required the management of competing obligations. She was grateful to the British crown. She was also aware that her gratitude was expected. that it was the price of her accommodation, and that the power dynamic between herself and her protectors was not one between equals. She had been born a Grand Duchess of Russia. She was now living in a house provided by the King of England. The shift in scale was not merely financial, it was existential. She had gone from being a figure in one of Europe's most powerful courts to being a figure in another court's margin, present, acknowledged, and fundamentally dependent. The transition from Frogmore Cottage to Wilderness House at Hampton Court, which occurred after George Fee's death, added another layer of complexity to Zinnia's position. Frogmore was in the grounds of Windsor Castle, close to the center of British royal life, geographically intimate with the family that was sheltering her. Hampton Court was further away, more self-contained, and in some sense more honest about what her position actually was. She was not a member of the British royal family. She was a relative living in a property that the crown controlled and could, in theory, reclaim. The distinction between grace and right is subtle, but Zinnia felt it, and her later years at Hampton Court were shaped by an awareness that she occupied space by permission rather than by entitlement. Her household, by the 1940s and 1950s, had contracted to a fraction of what it had been. Servants who had once numbered in the dozens were reduced to one or two. The furniture was adequate but not imperial. The meals were plain. The routines were those of a devout elderly woman whose days were organized around the Orthodox liturgy, correspondence, the occasional visit from a grandchild, and the quiet management of diminishing resources. She kept photographs of the old life. She maintained the icons that connected her to Russian Orthodoxy. She did not complain in public. What she said in private is largely lost because Zinnia was not unlike her brother's wife or her cousin Maria Pavlovna, a woman who committed her inner life to paper for others to read. The parallel story of the Dowager Empress's final years in Denmark provides the closing movement of the first generation's experience. Maria Feodorovna lived at Feodora, the villa near Copenhagen, that she and her sister Alexandra had purchased together before the war, and at various Danish royal residences where hospitality was extended with the warmth that the Danish royal family, smaller, less powerful, but in this instance more consistently generous than the British, showed to the woman who had once been their most famous export. The Danish public regarded her with a respect that combined national pride with dynastic sentimentality. She was Dagmar of Denmark, the girl who had married a Tsar, and her return, broken, widowed, bereaved, touched a chord that transcended politics. Her daily life was circumscribed by age, grief, and the refusal to acknowledge the full scale of what had happened. She received visitors, she attended church, she corresponded with family members across Europe. She did not discuss her son's fate in terms that acknowledged its finality. The emotional cost of that refusal was borne primarily by herself and secondarily by the people around her, who were forced to navigate conversations in which the central fact, Nicholas is dead, could not be spoken. Whether that silence protected her or imprisoned her is a question that does not have a tidy answer. It may have done both. She died on October 13th, 1928, at Feodora. She was 80 years old. She was buried initially at Roskilde Cathedral, and later in 2006, her remains were transferred to the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg, reunited in death with the husband she had married 62 years earlier. The repatriation of her remains was a symbolic act that carried more weight than its organizers may have intended. It said that Russia, having expelled the Romanovs, was prepared to receive them back, but only as bones, only as relics, only as objects of historical ceremony, rather than as participants in political life. The dynasty's return to Russia was a funeral, not a restoration. There's something about that distinction that speaks to the entire story. With the Dowager Empress's death, the era of imperial presence in exile ended. What remained was imperial memory, carried by children and grandchildren who had to decide, individually and without guidance, how much of that memory to preserve, how much to discard, and how much to transform into something that could survive in a world that had moved on. The immediate aftermath of the Marlborough's departure rippled differently through each branch of the family, and the ripples carried different temperatures. For Zinnia's sons, arrival in England meant the beginning of a long and largely unsuccessful attempt to convert imperial training into practical employment. The eldest, Prince Andrei Alexandrovich, settled eventually in London, where he lived on limited means and married a woman from outside the émigré community. Prince Feodor, as already described, made his way to Paris and entered the world of ordinary labor. Prince Nikita married Countess Maria Vorontsova-Dashkova, whose own family had connections that provided a degree of stability. Prince Dmitry Alexandrovich lived quietly. Prince Rostislav struggled more visibly, his life marked by the kind of financial precariousness that became routine for younger Romanovs without independent means or marketable skills. Prince Vasily crossed the Atlantic. Each son's trajectory represented a different calculation about how much of the old identity to preserve, how much of the new world to embrace, and how much pride to swallow in the process. The swallowing of pride was not a metaphor, it was a daily practice, and the people who managed it most successfully were often the ones who had the least invested in the pretense that nothing had changed. Fyodor's decision to drive a taxi was, at one level, a simple economic choice. At another level, it was an act of psychological courage that many of his relatives could not match. To sit behind the wheel of a Parisian taxicab, to wait for fares, to navigate the city's streets under the direction of passengers who did not know and would not care that their driver was a prince of the Russian imperial house, that required a capacity for self-effacement that the old court had never taught and that some Romanovs never acquired. Feodor acquired it. He drove. He earned. He later trained as an architect and built a career in a profession where competence was evaluated by the quality of the work rather than the length of the pedigree. His life would never make a glamorous film. It would make an honest one. The financial archaeology of Romanov exile, the question of where the money went and how the survivors managed without it, reveals a pattern of rapid depletion followed by long-term improvisation. The jewels that the Dowager Empress, Xenia, and other family members had carried out of Russia were substantial in aggregate but unevenly distributed. The Dowager Empress's collection, which included items of significant historical and commercial value, was the largest single reservoir. After her death in 1928, the disposition of these jewels became a matter of negotiation between the British and Danish royal families, with Xenia and Olga as the principal beneficiaries. The jewels were valued, some were sold, the proceeds were divided. The amounts were significant by ordinary household standards and wholly insufficient to maintain anything resembling the standard of living that the family had known before 1917. Xenia's share financed her living expenses for the next 3 decades, but the financing was a process of gradual liquidation, selling a piece here, a piece there, each sale reducing the family's tangible connection to its past. The emotional weight of these transactions should not be underestimated. For Xenia, every brooch and every necklace was simultaneously a financial asset and a physical memory. The diamonds that her mother had worn at court, the pearls that had been wedding gifts, the brooches that marked births and anniversaries, these were not inventory items. They were the material evidence of a world that no longer existed, and selling them was a form of erasure conducted in the back rooms of London jewelers by a woman who understood exactly what she was losing and had no choice but to lose it. The same arithmetic applied, with variations across the diaspora. Kshestinska had brought out jewels of her own, the accumulations of a career spent at the intersection of ballet and imperial patronage, and these sustained the household until gambling and the depression consumed them. Maria Pavlovna had some possessions, but relied primarily on earned income. Dmitry had nothing of his own and depended first on social generosity, then on Audrey Emery's money. The younger generation, with few exceptions, started from zero. The net effect was a family that had been one of the wealthiest in the world in 1913 and was, by the 1930s, spread across a spectrum that ranged from comfortable dependence to genuine hardship. The distance between those extremes was determined not by talent or virtue, but by the accidents of marriage, geography, and the particular mix of possessions each individual had managed to carry through the collapse. The social texture of exile also deserves close attention, because the Romanovs did not live in isolation. They were part of a much larger Russian immigration, numbering at its peak perhaps 1.5 million people, scattered across Europe, the Americas and beyond, whose members included aristocrats, officers, professionals, artists, and ordinary citizens who had fled the revolution for reasons ranging from political conviction to personal survival. This larger community provided the Romanovs with a social context that was simultaneously supportive and suffocating. Supportive because it gave them a world in which their language, their faith, their manners, and their memories were shared. Suffocating because it trapped many of them inside a past that the rest of the world was rapidly forgetting. The Russian Orthodox churches in Paris, London, and other exile centers became the institutional spine of this community. The church at Rue de Rue in Paris was, for decades, the unofficial capital of Russian exile, a place where former generals sat next to former taxi drivers, where a Grand Duchess and a shopkeeper shared the liturgy, and where the old social hierarchy survived in attenuated form inside a religious practice that both preserved and sanctified it. Xenia attended the Russian church in London with the regularity of a woman for whom the liturgy was the last surviving structure of the world she had lost. Olga attended in Denmark and later in Canada. Kshasinska attended in Paris. For all of them, the church provided something that neither money nor social connection could supply: continuity. The words, the music, the incense, the icons. These were the same as they had been in St. Petersburg, in Moscow, in the palace chapels and the cathedral services of the old empire. Everything else had changed. The liturgy had not. The émigré community also produced a body of memoir and testimony that forms the documentary's primary source base for the exile period. Maria Pavlovna's memoirs, published in English, are the most vivid personal account of the transition from imperial privilege to commercial labor. Sandro's memoirs provide the political and analytical framework. Felix Yusupov, and not a Romanov by blood but connected by marriage and by the Rasputin affair, wrote extensively about the exile world. Kshasinska published her own memoirs. Collectively, these texts create a multi-voiced portrait of a community in which the social rules of the old world persisted as habit even after they had ceased to function as law. The persistence of habit is one of the most psychologically revealing features of Romanov exile. People continued to use titles. They continued to observe precedents at social gatherings. They continued to address one another with the formalities that the imperial court had required and that exile had rendered simultaneously meaningless and indispensable. Meaningless because the titles conferred no power, no income, no legal standing. Indispensable because the titles were, for many, the last proof that they were who they said they were, that the world they remembered had existed, that the people they had been were real, and that the catastrophe that had destroyed everything else had not destroyed their identity. To abandon the titles would have been to concede that the revolution had succeeded in its deepest ambition, the erasure not just of a political system, but of the people who had embodied it. That refusal to be erased took different forms in different individuals. In Kirill and his heirs, it took the form of a constitutional claim. In Xenia, it took the form of quiet persistence. In Kshasinska, it took the form of professional excellence. In Olga, it took the form of domestic contentment. In the younger generation, it took the form of adaptation, some graceful, some reluctant, some barely conscious. But in all of them, it operated as a defense against the specific cruelty of their situation. They were famous for something that had been taken from them, recognized for a status they no longer held, and defined by a past they could neither escape nor restore. The question that remained, the question that would carry the story from the mid-20th century into the 21st, was what would happen when the last people who remembered the empire personally were gone, when memory became history, when habit became heritage. When the Romanov name passed from the possession of individuals who had lived inside the old world to the possession of descendants, who knew it only from photographs, letters, and the fading voices of grandparents who spoke less and less as the years accumulated, that transition was already underway, and its consequences would shape everything that remains of the Romanov story today. The deaths of the first generation came at intervals that punctuated the exiled decades like the tolling of a slow bell. Sandro died in 1933 in Roquebrune-Cap-Martin on the French Riviera, having spent his last years writing the memoirs that would become one of the primary sources for the old court's internal politics. He was 66. He had spent the last 16 years of his life as a man without a country, without a command, and without the marriage that had once anchored his public identity. His relationship with Xenia had ended in emotional terms long before it ended in legal ones, and his death removed from the exile world one of the few men who had combined genuine political intelligence with direct personal experience of the imperial system's inner workings. What he understood, and what his memoirs convey with more honesty than most Romanov writings, was that the empire had not been destroyed by external forces alone. It had been weakened from within by the very structures that had once made it powerful. The concentration of authority in one man, the suppression of independent initiative, the elevation of loyalty over competence, and the assumption that stability was a permanent condition rather than an achievement that had to be earned every day. His analysis, written in exile, was more penetrating than anything he had been able to articulate while the system he described was still in operation. That is its own kind of tragedy. The clarity that arrives after the capacity to act on it has gone. Victoria Melita died in 1936 in Amorbach in Germany. Kirill died in 1938 in Neuilly-sur-Seine, near Paris. Their deaths transferred the legitimist claim to their son Vladimir, who would maintain it for the next 54 years with a consistency that impressed his supporters and exasperated his detractors. Vladimir lived in Madrid, later in Paris, and conducted himself as the head of a royal house that existed in legal theory and émigré society, but not in political reality. He married Princess Leonida Bagration-Mukreni in 1948, and their daughter Maria, born in 1953, would inherit the claim and carry it into the 21st century. The claim's persistence is remarkable. 3 generations of the same branch have now maintained that the headship of the Russian imperial house is theirs by right, despite the fact that the institution over which they claim headship has not existed for more than a century. Whether that persistence represents conviction, stubbornness, or a kind of dynastic muscle memory, the inability to stop performing sovereignty even when sovereignty has no stage, is a question the family itself answers differently depending on which branch you ask. The Romanov Family Association, formed in 1979 and subsequently reorganized, represents the collective alternative to the legitimist position. Its membership includes descendants scattered across multiple countries, and its public position is that the question of dynastic headship cannot be settled by any one branch's proclamation. The association's website lists living descendants in the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, France, and the United States, and identifies Princess Olga Andreevna as its president and Prince Rostislav Rostislavovich as its vice president. The association does not claim political power. It claims custodianship of the family's history, of its collective memory, and of the principle that the Romanov name belongs to all its bearers, not to one claimant. Princess Olga Andreevna, born in London in 1950, is the granddaughter of Prince Andrei Alexandrovich, one of Zinya's sons, and has spent much of her public life as a writer, lecturer, and representative of the family's British branch. Her existence, a British-born, English-speaking descendant of the Romanov dynasty living quietly in the United Kingdom, illustrates the final stage of the exile story's evolution. The displacement is no longer displacement, it is simply life. The name is no longer a burden to be managed, it is a heritage to be interpreted. And the interpretation is no longer shaped by grief, by financial emergency, or by the hope of restoration. It is shaped by the slower, calmer work of historical reflection, family memory, and the question of what stories are worth telling. Prince Rostislav Rostislavovich, an artist with connections to the United Kingdom, occupies a similar position. A contemporary figure whose Romanov identity is one strand in a life that includes professional work, personal interest, and the kind of ordinary existence that the first generation of exiles could not have imagined and the second generation worked to achieve. He and Princess Olga represent the current face of the Romanov family in its non-legitimist configuration, public without being political, historical without being historical reenactors, connected to the past without being imprisoned by it. On the legitimist side, Maria Vladimirovna, born in 1953, maintains an active presence that includes public appearances, a website, and the kind of institutional formality, issuing honors, receiving petitioners, maintaining a household structure, that her grandfather Kirill began and her father Vladimir continued. Her claim is contested by the Romanov Family Association and rejected by a significant portion of the extended family, but it persists, and its persistence is itself the final chapter of the exile story. The dynasty that was destroyed in 1917 has not even now agreed on the terms of its own afterlife. The family that could not prevent its destruction has been unable to agree on the meaning of its survival. That disagreement is not a failure. It is the natural consequence of a catastrophe so large and so prolonged that no single narrative can contain it. The Romanovs who escaped the revolution did not escape into one story. They escaped into dozens of stories, some dignified, some desperate, some ordinary, some absurd, and the divergence of those stories over the course of a century has made collective agreement on anything except the facts of genealogy effectively impossible. What remains, then, is not a family in the traditional sense. It is a constellation, a pattern of connected points spread across the globe, each one glowing with a different intensity, each one marking a different answer to the question that this documentary has been asking since its first frame. What happened to the Romanov relatives who escaped the revolution? They lived, they worked, they married, they sold jewels and drove taxis and painted flowers and taught ballet and claimed thrones that did not exist. They disagreed about who they were and what their name meant. They raised children who are alive today. And they carried through all of it the peculiar weight of belonging to a family that the world would not let them forget and could not help them restore. The lives that followed the Marlborough, the decades of exile tracked across 5 countries and 3 generations, were not lived in sequence. They overlapped, intersected, and diverged, and the final reckoning of what happened to the Romanov relatives who escaped the revolution requires stacking those lives against one another, not to judge them, but to see the full range of what survival meant. Consider the span of outcomes. In one corner of the story, Xenia Alexandrovna spent 41 years in English exile, housed by the British crown, sustained by the sale of her mother's jewels, and attended by a household that shrank from the dozens to the handful. In another corner, her brother's youngest sister Olga died in a flat above a barbershop in Toronto, having painted more than 2,000 works and raised a family in a country where her surname meant less than her skill with a watercolor brush. In Paris, Maria Pavlovna had built and lost a business, buried a child, and written about the experience with a directness that ensured her voice would outlast her. In Davos, Dmitri had been extinguished by tuberculosis at the age of 50, his charm no longer sufficient to sustain a body that the old world had not prepared for hardship. In Paris, Kshasinska continued teaching ballet until her body could no longer demonstrate the position she was describing. She died in 1971 at 99. The last living link to the pre-revolutionary Russian ballet world. Andrei had preceded her by 15 years, but to leave the story at the level of summary would be to commit the very error this documentary was designed to correct. The public version of the Romanov story deals in patterns: the doomed czar, the murdered children, the scattered exiles. The private version deals in individuals, and the individuals deserve to be tracked to their endings with the same specificity that was used to introduce them. Xenia Alexandrovna's final decade at Hampton Court was characterized by a quietness that concealed the full extent of her isolation. She had outlived her mother, her brother, most of her generation, and the social world that had given her adult life its structure. Her sons visited when they could, but they had their own lives, scattered across London, Paris, and the Americas, and the distances between them, geographical and emotional, widened as the decades passed. She attended the Russian Orthodox Church in London with diminishing frequency as her health declined. She received fewer visitors, her correspondence thinned. The woman who had once been the center of Romanov's social life in Britain was becoming, by the late 1950s, a solitary figure in a grace-and-favour house, sustained by faith, routine, and the stubborn refusal to regard her situation as pathetic. She was not pathetic. She was enduring. And the endurance, which had defined her public persona for 4 decades, continued until November 20th, 1960, when she died in her sleep at Wilderness House. She was 85 years old. She was buried at Roquebrune Cap Martin, alongside other members of the Romanov family, in a cemetery above the Mediterranean, a long way from St. Petersburg, a long way from Crimea, and a long way from the ship that had carried her away from both. What she left behind was not memoirs or business ventures or an artistic body of work. What she left behind was a reputation for dignity under impossible circumstances, a reputation earned not through dramatic gestures, but through the daily unremarkable practice of behaving as though one situation, however reduced, still merited self-respect. In the taxonomy of exile responses, hers was the most conservative and in some ways the most costly. She preserved the form of the old world without possessing its substance, and the gap between form and substance was the space in which she lived for 41 years. Maria Pavlovna's death in 1958, 2 years before Xenia's, closed the exile story's most dynamic thread. Her memoirs, Education of a Princess and a Princess in Exile, remain essential reading for anyone trying to understand what the revolution did to the people who survived it, because Maria Pavlovna wrote without the protective distance of official narrative. She wrote about prices. She wrote about fatigue. She wrote about the humiliation of asking for credit from shopkeepers who knew her title and doubted her solvency. She wrote about the death of her son Roman with a grief that pierced the page. And she wrote about the bread and milk revelation, the moment when she realized that she had never known, in all her years of imperial privilege, what ordinary food costs. with a candor that transformed personal embarrassment into a universal observation about the relationship between wealth and ignorance. Her closing years were spent in relative obscurity. The embroidery business was gone. The perfume had failed. The marriages had ended. She lived in Paris with the accumulated experience of a woman who had been a Grand Duchess, a princess, a divorcee, a refugee, an entrepreneur, a mother, a writer, and a worker, and who had discovered through that accumulation that none of those identities was sufficient on its own. She did not need to articulate the lesson. Her life articulated it for her. Jasinska's death at 99 in 1971 closed the cultural thread. Her ballet school had shaped dancers across decades. Her longevity, she had been born under Alexander III and died under Brezhnev, gave her life a span that encompassed the entire arc of Russian history, from late empire to mature Soviet state. She was buried in the cemetery of Sainte-Geneviève-des-Bois, the great Russian necropolis outside Paris, where so many émigrés found their final resting place, a French suburb that became, through the accumulated weight of Russian exile, a memorial landscape for a world that had ceased to exist. Prince Vasily's death in California in 1989, on the eve of the Soviet Union's own collapse, closed the most American thread. He had lived in the United States for decades. He had worked manual and commercial jobs. He had married and raised a family. California had no use for Russian princes. It had use for workers, for farmers, for people who could plant a vineyard and tend chickens and show up when they said they would. Vasily had been all of those things. His life was the least romantic thread in the Romanov exile story, and for that reason perhaps the most honestly resolved. In the next generation, the fates dispersed further still. Dmitri's son, Paul Romanovsky-Elinsky, grew up in America, served in the United States Marine Corps, and became the mayor of Palm Beach, Florida, a civic career conducted under a version of his father's name in a subtropical resort town that bore no resemblance to the St. Petersburg palaces where his grandfather had plotted against Rasputin. Fyodor Alexandrovich practiced architecture in Paris until his death in 1968, having long since left the taxi behind. Natalia Paley, the morganatic princess turned fashion icon, died in New York in 1981. Her later years marked by the quiet that descends on formerly glamorous women when the world's appetite for their particular form of beauty has moved on. Each of these deaths closed a thread that had begun in imperial Russia and ended in the democratic West. The generational echoes that run through this story are structural, not coincidental. The first generation, the people who remembered the empire as adults, spent their exile mourning, adapting, and in some cases claiming. The second generation, the people who remembered the empire as children or knew it only through family narrative, spent their lives managing a legacy they had not chosen and could not escape. The third and fourth generations, the people alive today, have the distance to treat the Romanov name as heritage rather than wound. There is a particular echo through the women's stories that the documentary should not leave unnamed. The imperial system trained Romanov women for marriage, social performance, and the management of large households staffed by servants. It did not train them for independence, and yet when independence was forced upon them, many of them proved more capable of it than the men. Maria Pavlovna built a business, Jasinska built a school, Olga built a painting practice, Natalia Paley built a career, Zinnia built endurance, which is its own form of construction. The pattern is not absolute. These women suffered. Their adaptations were born of necessity, not choice. But the fact that they adapted, that they found in themselves resources the imperial system had been specifically designed to make unnecessary, is one of the exile story's most quietly powerful revelations. The men's pattern was different and in many cases harder. Dmitri drifted. Sandro analyzed, Kirill claimed. Andrei gambled and then lived off his wife's earnings. A Grand Duke who could not command a regiment was a man without a purpose. A Grand Duchess who could not host a ball was a woman who could still sew, paint, teach, or sell. The gender dissymmetry of the exile experience is not the story's thesis. The thesis is larger than any single pattern, but it is one of the patterns the viewer will notice and the documentary should acknowledge without forcing into a lesson. The cultural afterlife of the Romanov story has been rich, persistent, and largely misdirected. For most of the 20th century, public interest focused on four things: the execution at Ekaterinburg, the Anastasia mystery, the Fabergé eggs, and the generalized glamour of a doomed court. The actual experience of the survivors, that the people who got out, what they did, how they lived, remained comparatively obscure. The books that have engaged most directly with the survivor story include Perry and Pleshikov's The Flight of the Romanovs and Helen Rappaport's After the Romanovs, the latter centering the Paris exile and documenting the transformation of former princes and duchesses into workers and refugees. On screen, the 2018 Amazon anthology The Romanovs used the legacy as a thematic frame for contemporary stories about identity and inheritance, but said little about the actual historical experience. The Anastasia films, animated and otherwise, kept the name in popular circulation while reinforcing the narrowest possible version. The Hillwood Museum exhibition on Natalia Paley, drawing on Smithsonian curatorial work, represents a newer approach, one that takes Romanov exile seriously as cultural phenomenon, exploring how the aesthetics of the old world found new expression in the commercial economies of the 20th century. What remains of the Romanov family today exists in several registers at once. The Romanov Family Association lists living descendants in the United Kingdom, Spain, Italy, France, and the United States. Princess Olga Andreevna, born in London in 1950, serves as the association's president, a British-born, English-speaking descendant who has spent much of her public life as a writer and representative of the family's history. Prince Rostislav Rostislavovich, an artist with the United Kingdom connections, serves as vice president. Both represent a generation that has grown up knowing the family's story as history rather than memory. On the rival line, Maria Vladimirovna maintains the legitimist claim, with a website, public appearances, and the trappings of a royal household without a realm. Her son, Grand Duke George Mikhailovich, born in 1981, represents the claim's next generation. The family's internal disagreement about its own identity, legitimist claim versus collective association, has now lasted nearly as long as the exile itself. The physical remnants of the old world are scattered across museums, auction houses, and private collections. The Vladimir tiara sits in the British Royal Collection, worn by queens who inherited it not through Russian succession, but through purchase. Romanov jewels surface periodically at auction, each one a small, brilliant fragment of a vanished world. The palaces in St. Petersburg are state museums. The Crimean villas have had other occupants. The reburial of Nicholas II and his family in the Peter and Paul Cathedral in 1998, attended by descendants and by the Russian president, placed the murdered Tsar inside the continuum of Russian history, acknowledging the imperial family as historical figures rather than enemies of the people. The canonization in 2000 by the Russian Orthodox Church added a religious dimension. Whether Russia's relationship with the Romanov past will continue to evolve is a question for Russian politics. What belongs to this documentary is the observation that the survivors' descendants have watched from London and Paris and Palm Beach and Toronto as the country that expelled their grandparents has slowly, uncertainly, and incompletely begun to reconsider what it did. Olga Alexandrovna's death on November 24, 1960, just 4 days after Zenia's, though neither sister knew the other was dying, carried a structural weight that transcended in coincidence. The two surviving sisters of Nicholas II died within a week of each other, one in the grounds of an English palace and one in a flat above a barbershop in suburban Toronto. Each had spent 4 decades answering the same question: what do you do with a life that should have been lived inside an empire? In opposite ways, Xenia answered with endurance, Olga answered with release. Neither answer was wrong, neither was complete. They were the best responses available to women whose training had prepared them for everything except the lives they actually led. Olga had painted until her hands could no longer hold a brush with steadiness. Her works, landscapes, flowers, Russian scenes from memory, survive in private collections and occasionally surface at auction, where they are valued both as art and as artifacts, small rectangles of color produced by a woman whose life stretched from the Winter Palace to a Canadian farm. The cemetery of Sainte-Geneviève-des-Bois, 25 kilometers south of Paris, deserves its own moment in this story because it is, in a sense, the physical repository of the exile. Hundreds of Russian émigrés are buried there: generals, professors, taxi drivers, duchesses, seamstresses, children. Kshesinska lies there. Members of the Yusupov family lie there. Russian Orthodox crosses stand above graves inscribed in Cyrillic, the language of a country that most of the people buried beneath them were never able to return to. The cemetery is not a tourist attraction. It is not grand in the way that Russian cemeteries once were. It is a suburban burial ground that became, through the accumulated weight of a century of exile, the closest thing the Russian emigration has to a national memorial. Walking through it, reading the names and the dates, you understand something about the Romanov story that the biographical threads cannot fully convey on their own. The family's exile was not an isolated event. It was part of a migration that displaced millions, and the Romanovs' experience, however uniquely privileged their starting point, was continuous with the experience of every Russian who left and could not go back. The Anastasia claimants, who occupied public attention for much of the 20th century, warrant a brief acknowledgement not because they are central to this story, but because they illustrate how powerfully the Romanov name continued to resonate decades after the revolution. Anna Anderson, whose claim to be the surviving Grand Duchess Anastasia was pursued through courts, newspapers, and popular culture for more than 60 years, was eventually disproven by DNA analysis in the 1990s. Her story, and the stories of the dozens of other individuals who claimed Romanov identity over the decades, demonstrated that the dynasty's cultural afterlife had an intensity that far exceeded its political relevance. People wanted the Romanovs to have survived. People wanted the cellar not to have been final. That desire, which drove the claimant phenomena, also drove the documentaries, the films, the novels, and the continuing public fascination with a family whose actual surviving members were, for the most part, living quiet lives in London flats, Parisian apartments, and Canadian farmhouses, unrecognized and largely uninterested in the mythology's version of their own history. The reburial of Nicholas II and his family in July 1998 at the Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg was the single most symbolically charged event in the Romanov story's modern chapter. The remains, identified through DNA analysis that matched living descendants, were interred with full state honors in the presence of President Boris Yeltsin, who used the occasion to deliver remarks acknowledging Russia's responsibility for the murders. The ceremony was attended by members of the Romanov family, some traveling to Russia for the first time. The experience of standing in the cathedral where Tsars had been buried for centuries, attending a funeral 80 years late for relatives they had never known, was described by participants as overwhelming in ways that defied simple categorization. It was grief, it was relief, it was political theater, it was genuine, it was all of those things at once, and the fact that it could not be reduced to any single emotional register was perhaps the truest thing about it. The canonization of the imperial family as passion bearers by the Russian Orthodox Church in 2000 added a religious dimension to the story that earlier chapters had not anticipated. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were not declared martyrs in the traditional theological sense. They did not die for the faith, but passion bearers, a category recognizing those who face death with Christian acceptance. The canonization was controversial within the church and within the family. Some members welcomed it as the spiritual completion of a long injustice. Others were uncomfortable with the elevation of Nicholas, whose political judgments had contributed significantly to the catastrophe, to any form of sainthood. The debate echoed, in theological language, the same unresolved question that the family had been carrying since 1918. Who was responsible, and who was redeemed, and where did pity end and accountability begin? The question of what Russia owes the Romanovs, and what the Romanovs owe Russia, has been debated in Russian politics, in émigré circles, and in the family itself for more than a century. Various proposals for the return of confiscated property have been raised and rejected. The legitimist branch has made overtures toward a formal role. Nothing has materialized. The Romanov presence in modern Russia is ceremonial, not constitutional, and the family's relationship with the Russian state remains one of mutual wariness, Russia unwilling to concede too much to a dynasty it violently replaced, the family unwilling to accept too little from a country it still regards, in some branches at least, as rightfully theirs. In Britain, the Romanov presence is quieter and more settled. Wilderness House at Hampton Court, where Zinnia lived for decades, has been returned to other uses. The Russian Orthodox Cathedral of the Dormition in Knightsbridge remains a center of émigré spiritual life, and Romanov descendants attend services there alongside the broader Russian community. The connection between the Romanov family and the British royal family, forged by marriage in the 19th century and strained by the events of 1917, persists as a matter of genealogy, if not of active alliance. The resemblance between George V and Nicholas II, the cousins who looked alike and whose fates diverged so catastrophically, continues to surface in public conversation whenever the history of either monarchy is discussed. It is a resemblance that reminds the viewer that these were not separate stories. They were one story, told in two countries, with two very different endings. The last living link to the HMS Marlborough evacuation died decades ago. The certificates issued on the ship have become collector's items. The ship itself was scrapped in 1932. The harbor at Yalta has been rebuilt, occupied, fought over, and rebuilt again. The Crimean villas, where the Romanovs spent their last months on Russian soil, have had other occupants and other purposes. The physical world of the story has been almost entirely overwritten by the century that followed. What survives is paper, memory, and the family itself. Dispersed, divided, and still, after all this time, trying to agree on what it means to be Romanov after the Romanovs. The world remembers the Romanovs who died in one cellar room in Ekaterinburg on a July night in 1918. That memory is fixed, terrible, and complete. This story has been about the Romanovs who lived. The ones who boarded a British warship with certificates in their luggage, who watched the coast of Crimea disappear into mist, and who spent the rest of their lives discovering that history had made them refugees before they had even learned how to buy bread. They did not all become tragic in the same way. Some worked, some posed, some claimed, some remembered, some disappeared into ordinary life and were grateful for the disappearance. There is no neat moral to that. There is only the image of a dynasty that celebrated 300 years of rule and then, in the space of a single generation, learned what it meant to survive without the thing that had given survival its meaning.